So hey guys, how are you all? Welcome to. So we are back with a brand new movie on what if neglected Naruto was kidnapped by Team Akatsuki with help of Sakura. But before we start, be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Now let's begin the story. Uzumaki Naruto was dying. He wasn't completely sure how that was possible with the Kyuubi POW. Earing him, the demon fox was obsessed with living at all costs even if it meant keeping his host alive. Though Naruto had to wonder whether or not it was even possible to truly kill the thing, but it was happening. Fortunately for Naruto, the Kyuubi wasn't one to simply lie down and die. In fact, he was quite a stubborn beast. Something the human and the fox actually had in common. It had kept both of them alive. Or as alive as the Kyuubi could be considered while trapped in his host's mind, and in their few confrontations it had explained just how cheerfully it went about planning to show him Saint how lively it could be when it finally freed itself, on a great many occasions. So while Naruto was surprised that his body was dying, he wasn't surprised to find himself in the familiar catacombs of his mind. Nor was he surprised at the face behind the bars that he'd gotten so used to seeing in situations where he needed the help. You've really done it now, brat. I'm tired. So tired, he'd fought. His entire life. He'd fought as hard as possible for acknowledgement, for his friends, for his village, but in the end it failed all the same. I don't care. Get back in control of this pathetic body and finish what you started. I will not become that disgusting creature's pet again. I can't. Not a cry, not a plea, just a simple statement of fact. It was quite literally beyond his ability. Almost the entire top half of his torso was gone. The only reason he was probably even still aware in any form was because of the seal containing the Kyuubi. Even that would fade sooner or later. Damn it all, you pathetic kid. Do you know how hard I've worked to keep this body going for so many years? How many times I've had to pull you back from the brink of death because of your foolish determination to charge blindly into every situation. What can I do? What's left to try? Sorry Fox, and I'm not just saying it. I'm really, honestly, truly sorry. The Kyuubi was the last thing that he'd expected to fail. If only because he'd expected it to be satisfied with just about any conclusion that could cause so much chaos. But I'm out. I've got nothing left. I wish I could just hop back up, but I can't. Most of them are dead by now, the rest will probably follow. Even the snake bastard probably doesn't have much more fight left. Not against them. You've never stopped before. Why now? The fox didn't seem quite as angry as before. It wasn't pleased, it certainly wasn't comforting by any measure. It seemed almost confused. Like I said, nothing left. No chakra, no reason, no chance. It's a lost cause. Hey, never thought I'd say something like that. They'd just never been so completely outmatched before. On the losing side, sure, but one of these people had obliterated the entire village already. Most of the Akatsuki was gone, but the few that were left, well, they were just plain impossible to defeat, especially working together. Worthless insects, all of you. If you aren't going to do anything about this, then I will. Let's do a little reality bending. Say what? Reality bending? What's the crazy old fox on about? I'm not ready to die, but I'm not going to sit here and fall apart like some whimpering little rodent. I can't say I've ever tried something this extreme. But for once I think I'll take a page out of what did you call it? Ah yes, the Uzumaki Naruto Shinobi Handbook, and charge in like an idiot. No doubt this will hurt. The fox grinned at that. Very, very badly. Good night. And he was right. If Naruto still had a functioning mouth, he would have screamed. Gaara of the Sand was knelt by his fellow Jinchuriki's body. Former Jinchuriki, at least. They'd simply run out. He still had some control over his sand, but nothing like he'd had with Shukaku. At least not after as much fighting as they'd done. For once, he was actually wishing that he'd still had his demon. As it was, he was practically helpless at this point. All of them were. Even the greatest of shinobi wouldn't be able to stave off exhaustion forever. They hadn't expected some massive final battle. They'd expected Naruto and his team to finish the job. As bizarre as it seemed, defeating enemies that seemed undefeatable was just what Konohagakure's Team 7 did. Unfortunately, that wasn't quite how it happened. The remaining members of the Akatsuki had decided it was Tim E to make one last bid for the Kyuubi after this, Pain had already decimated Konoha in his initial search for Naruto, and with the eight-tailed beast finally in their hands due to some crafty work by the infamous Hoshigaki Kisame. At the moment, it was working out rather well for them. Most of Konoha's best were already gone. Tsunade had been killed months earlier, attempting to avenge Jiraiya and save the village. The Akatsuki's leader had done the deed, just as he'd apparently done with at least one of her fellow Sannin. Not to mention most of the Leaf Village. Naruto had been blaming himself ever since. Insisting that he could have helped if he'd only learned of the invasion sooner, finished his training properly instead of taking so long to mourn his lost mentor. The right hand of the Akatsuki, if he could really be called such, they weren't completely clear on that, was vicious. Unstoppable. A seemingly endless supply of summons, the ability to absorb ninjutsu and negate taijutsu, borderline immortality. Control over every chakra element. He'd already killed a considerable number of Konoha's finest, and none of their allies would be able to get more help to them anytime soon. Not long ago the Raikage had tried to call for an alliance after the kidnapping of Kumogakure's last Jinchuriki, but it had ended in a miserable failure. Ambushes by the Akatsuki had left the Tsuchikage and Raikage dead, the Mizukage and Hokage missing, and since he was still recovering his powers after losing Shukaku he was of limited use on his own. Suna had welcomed Konoha's refugees, but even their combined forces weren't nearly enough and they couldn't count on the other villages to help when they were in chaos with the loss of their leaders. And now, their attackers had already finished. Most of the Jonin started working on the other shinobi of Naruto's class. The now deceased Lee's master, Guy and his remaining students were busy trying to defeat the blue, almost shark-like member of the Akatsuki. The greatest of the 7 swordsmen of the mist, they called him. Sakura and the 3 shinobi that had been traveling with Sasuke had left in pursuit of the strange plant-like Akatsuki agent some time earlier. When the numbers had still been to their advantage, after he'd killed the young Uchiha by surprise. Apparently his one-time enemy, as well as his allies, had been planning to turn on the Akatsuki when the time arrived. For what reason? Perhaps only the fallen Uchiha could have revealed the truth, and Zetsu had simply been waiting for his own opportunity to deal with the traitors. Looking into the distance, he watched the battle that none of them had seen coming. Nothing in the world could have prepared them for Orochimaru to come to their aid, courtesy of his servant's absorption of his remains. He was supposed to be dead, after all. Of course, none of them believed for a second that it was out of goodwill towards them or Konoha. In fact, he'd probably come with the intention of taking Sasuke's body. But with Sasuke dead when he arrived, he'd turned his eyes on the only remaining Sharingan wielder on the field. The duel between them had only gone on for moments before Orochimaru had assumed his immense serpentine form, drawing on his last resort when the Uchiha easily subdued him. And he was still losing to Madara. He was performing far better than any of them had, certainly. However, slowly but surely, he was being pushed back just as everyone else had been. So there Gaara knelt, next to the body of one of the few people he could call a friend. He couldn't aid any of the others in a fight, considering how weak as he was at the moment. Between time it was taking to regain his powers, attempting to readjust to being susceptible to illness and sleep deprivation. And attempting to fight as he had when he still hosted the beast, he was far too drained to do much more than watch and fend off stray attacks. But standing guard over his friend's remains was the least he could do to repay all the blonde child had done. Then there was a great cry, almost a shriek, as the massive 8-headed snake fell. A standing but clearly weakened figure with dark hair emerged from the mouth of the final head, crawling to his feet. As the last remaining Sannin pulled the Kusanagi sword from his mouth, preparing for yet another battle with the last remaining Uchiha. Gaara heard something from behind him. Turning his eyes from the battlefield, he saw that a seal on Naruto's stomach had started to glow a bright scarlet. Before he had a chance to wonder what was happening, the world exploded into fire, an excruciating pain coursing through his body, followed by darkness and silence. He hurt like hell. That was all he could think of to describe it. Eyes slowly opening, he quickly closed them again, turning into his pillow to get away from the light. Wait, pillow. Shooting up in his bed, he frantically looked around, wondering what was going on. Did I survive? How could he be? What had happened? Where was everyone? Bringing his hand to his forehead, he noted yet another problem. And why the hell am I so small? Ah. He looked up at the ratty calendar on the wall, surprised to find that it was the old one he'd kept as a child. The problem was that the calendar was quite obviously wrong. According to the date, he should have been about 7. Taking a moment to think, his hazy mind pulled a few recent memories. They Kyuubi had done something. He wasn't sure what, but he knew that he'd heard the Kyuubi saying something about bending reality, or some such nonsense. So what? The giant ball of furry-looking chakra could send him back in time now. On the other hand, there really weren't many other reasons he could think of for why he was in a far younger version of his body. With no signs of Madara, pain, or the snake bastard anywhere. Maybe he was dead, and this was all some kind of strange afterlife. Or a genjutsu of some kind, but at reason would they have to put him in a genjutsu when he and the others were so clearly going to fail? They'd certainly never come off as the merciful sort, so he doubted it was a final act of kindness for a dying enemy. Of course, if he had in fact gone through some kind of freakish reality shift, he was probably just in shock, and the reality of it would hit him later. Regardless of what had happened, he'd never been one to sit around thinking. He was more of an action person, and at this particular moment the only thing that would help him figure out what was going on was probably just such an action. Well, only one way to find out. Delving into his mind, he found himself in front of a familiar set of barred doors, the seal holding them together still holding strong. Strangely, in this place his body was still that of a young adult. It was a little comforting to know that he wasn't just going completely insane. At the very least he knew that the Kyuubi was really there. Yet even though the place was very familiar to him, as was his mental image of himself, the sight inside was far from anything he'd seen while entering his mind before. The Kyuubi was in his cage, just as he'd expected the beast to be. However, there were some rather noticeable, and frankly, disturbing, differences. The sleeping fox was only a fraction of its normal size, and what was left didn't present an imposing image. Its fur was scattered and thin, missing in other places, and the translucent reddish tissue below was pulled tight over visible bone and muscle. It was missing all but a single tail, which was in only slightly better condition than the rest of its body, and to top it off there was a flood of pulsating chakra circling the slumbering beast, crawling over its mangy coat. Simply put, he'd seen rotten carcasses that had pulled off a more lively look. As he called out to the slumbering giant, a deep displeased rumble echoed from its mouth. As was his nature, Naruto only paid heed to this warning for a matter of seconds before the rather twisted form of logic he'd developed came into play. This particular brand of logic had a very simple solution to problems such as the one he was faced with. If you want something to wake up, and calling it doesn't work, poke it with a stick. If no stick is available, then just settle for hitting it with something. And so hit the fox he did. Several times, in fact. He wasn't completely sure where the stones came from, but there were plenty of them sitting around on the ground. And if they were there, then why not use them? It was his mind, after all. So they'd probably just appeared because he wanted something to pester the old fox with. Within moments, he remembered just why he needed to be more careful when using what he'd come to call his super amazing genius logic. It tended to lead him into trouble. Trouble, in this case translating into an angry, several-story-high tall fox slamming itself against the bars of its cage, and trying to smash him with a huge paw. Snarling curses at him all the while. Yeah, it might have been smaller and rattier than before, but it had been a giant capable of towering over pretty much every wielding in Konohagakure during its attack on the village, so that wasn't saying much. Even at a mere fraction of its normal size, the demonic beast still completely dwarfed him. Hey, would you just calm down already, ya crazy old fuzzball? Finally noting what was right in front of him, the fox drew back from the edge of its cage, giving him an angry yet questioning glare as its mind began to settle. Yo, how are things going in there? Q-chan. Who are? Its eyes widened by a barely noticeable margin. No, you couldn't be. Naruto's eyes narrowed, taking in the Kyuubi's expression. It looked confused, amazed even. No, the fox was never confused. Or, at least, it never let on that it was. Shocked maybe, but never completely unable to comprehend a situation. What couldn't I be? What's with you, you old pain in the gut? You are my host. My Jinchuriki. Duh. It's not like that's anything new. Seriously, what's the deal with you? It didn't seem interested in listening. Quote. Impossible, I couldn't have been slumbering for so long. Its focus returned to the small human in front of its cage. You, brat, how old have you become? What is your age? Tell me. Huh, what are you freaking out about? You were talking to me just a little while ago. You know, with the Uchiha, crazy snake bastard, piercing man. Any of this ringing a bell? The Kyuubi's uncomprehending expression turned completely baffled. And the anger boiling below the surface of his typically calm, albeit sadistic, exterior was beginning to show. But then he never had liked it when Naruto talked down to him like that. Let's see, you said something about reality bending. The Kyuubi moved as though it was going to speak again, but instead turned away, pacing around in the cage. Naruto absently wondered if being smaller was more comfortable, given that pacing wasn't really an available option for the fox the last time he'd seen it. After it continued this for several minutes, Naruto was starting to get impatient. Oh, come on already. Say something. And, perhaps unsurprisingly, it didn't take long for those thoughts to make their way through the rather ineffective filter between his mind and mouth. Sometimes he really cursed his lack of patience, but in this case he just plain didn't care. Yo, fox, what's the holdup? Do ya know what's going on, or is all that fur on your head making it too hard to think? His prisoner growled at him, before walking back up to the bars, glaring down at his smaller form. If I said I was bending reality, then I likely was. Well, wasn't that just a clear and simple explanation? Tell me, how old are you? 7. According to that calendar, anyway. But like 10 years older last I remember. The fox looked him over for a moment. I see, beginning its pacing again. Naruto dropped to the ground with an all-too-audible sigh. This could take a while. He supposed it was a good thing he was stubborn, then. Minutes passed. Hours passed. Days passed. Or maybe he was just really getting bored with watching the fox trot back and forth across its cage. Alright Fuzzy, come on. Need to know info needed right here, right now. I might have sent you, back in time. Huh, you can do that. That would have been a nifty piece of information to have had at their disposal earlier. I'm not completely certain. I've always considered testing it to see. But I've never tried before. Or at least, I don't believe I have. You don't know. Talk about a bad memory. I mean really, what kind of crazy does it take for somebody to not remember that he could go back in time? The Kyuubi didn't growl, instead choosing to release a condescending huff at the boy. I didn't even remember meeting you. I wasn't even sure who you were at first. And I'm severely low on chakra. It may require so much energy that I rest until I've regenerated, unaware of whether or not I even did so. An intervention, like yours, he said this without attempting to hide the obvious aggravation. May have simply been something that hasn't occurred before. Wait, but you said, this will hurt badly, before you did whatever it is you did. How would you know that if you didn't know? It's not like I've never played with reality before. Just never to a significant extreme. Even minuscule changes take a major toll. I haven't done it in years. The last time I attempted to change time was over 100 years ago, and only by a few days. For that, I lost 2 tails, and nearly fell to the Hachibi. Damned tentacled ox almost had me that time. Oh, well that would explain it. Sort of. Think anybody could have come with us. He was positive that he'd felt something there with him when he was being pulled back. The last time he'd seen anyone, Gaara and Ino had been with him. Not that they would have been any use. It wasn't an insult to them, but Gaara's recovery from losing Shukaku was taking a long time, and he wouldn't stand a chance against Madara, hell, even with Shukaku. He might not have stood a chance against Madara. As for Ino, well, her main advantage came from the Yamanaka techniques that affected the mind, which would most likely fail against someone with the Mangekyo Sharingan and 100 years of experience. It might be possible. I've already admitted that I don't know the ins and outs of time travel. I must have been desperate to try it in the first place. What more do you want? I probably saved your life. Pathetic, weak little creatures that your kind are, I've no doubt that you needed my help often. Well, it was worth a shot. Man, we get into some crazy stuff. We do we? Was the fox actually amused? Oh yeah, no memory. Yeah, we always got into all sorts of trouble. The fox's brow rose up, clearly disbelieving. Okay, so it was usually me that got into trouble, but who cares about the details, right? So if you're a mere pup again, would you not have somewhere to be? Your culture is hardly a specialty of mine, but even you primitive. Hairless monkeys must have some form of tasks that the young are meant to perform. What d'ya mean? Where would I nay? Aw crap. The academy. Oh man, I'm gonna be late. And suddenly he was gone, leaving a smirking fox who quickly fell back into a deep slumber, waiting to regenerate his chakra. For the second time in less than 5 minutes, Naruto leapt up in his bed. This time, however, he was already sitting up when he jumped. The result was a very disgruntled child trying his best to untangle himself from the bed sheets, scrambling for whatever clothes were closest to him. Less than a minute later, still pulling a shoe on, Naruto hopped from his room on one leg, a package of cup ramen hanging from his mouth. Somehow managing to shut the door behind him, he finally got the shoe on. And began his mad dash for the academy. A mad dash that was brought to a crashing halt not too long afterwards, as he plowed into someone while running through the streets. Sorry fishnet, gotta go. Of course, he wasn't going to get away that easily. As he jumped up and started to run, he found himself in the air, running in place. Stopping his run, he turned his head to the woman holding him up by the back of his shirt, glancing at the woman with obvious and exaggerated frustration. He might just be able to make it to the academy on time if nothing else went wrong, and this was pushing it. Fishnet. Mitarashi Anko hadn't been called fishnet before. It sort of fit of course, so she wasn't going to complain about it. In all honesty, she kind of liked meeting a kid who had the guts to say something like that to her face. But she was still annoyed at the boy for crashing into her. She'd almost lost her dango, and in Mitarashi Anko's books, such an action would be unforgivable. Don't like fishnet. What about dango lady? Narrowing her eyes, Anko shook the small boy a few times. Fishnet was fine, cute even, but insulting the dango was a big no-no. It's Anko. And I almost lost my dango because of you, blondie. Oh come on, dango lady, it's not like you really lost it. I'm gonna be late, so you can just let me go now. Did she just get dismissed by a child? The Hokage could dismiss her. Jiraiya or Tsunade could dismiss her. Jonin like Kakashi and Asuma and a few of her peers could dismiss her. A prepubescent brat. Hell no. Okay, just listen up you little hellspawn. Because I'm not saying it again. I told you, my name Academy. Late. Her eyes shot behind him to the right for a moment, and she dropped him to the ground. Ah, fine. Alright. But watch where you're going next time, you little maggot. Muttering some quick and rather insincere thanks to the woman, Naruto sped off towards the academy yet again, leaving an annoyed Anko in his tracks. Turning to the man that had drawn her attention, she faced the silver-haired Jonin leaning against the nearby wall. So why'd you want me to let him go? Not like I was gonna hurt the brat. Much. And I thought I might finally get to have a little fun. Everyone around here is so boring. He may have been a brat, but the runt had balls. He's late. It wouldn't be nice to hold him back now, would it? His tardiness record is bad enough as it is. Wait, now that she thought about it, the kid had looked familiar. Who is the runt anyway? You don't recognize him. He's pretty famous around here. It's not like I'm around a lot. She looked at where the boy had taken off just a few moments earlier, and stood lost in thought for several minutes, flashing through memories of the many shinobi profiles they were required to read. It was him, wasn't it? The fox. Yep, he's the one. Lively, Little maggot was pretty hyper, seems like a little brat. She didn't even notice he smirked slowly making its way across her features. I like him. You like him. Anko chuckled. She'd have to keep tabs on the kid. Uruka-sensei. Naruto slammed through the door, gasping for breath. Not that he really needed to. He never ran out of energy that fast. In retrospect, it was somewhat amazing that he'd never realized there was something unusual about him before Mizuki let the cat out of the bag about his secret. Uzumaki Naruto. Uruka sighed. He was hardly surprised. Naruto was a good kid at heart, but he had serious priority issues. Late again. Naruto's jaw dropped. He could have sworn he'd made it in time. Oh come on. Hi. Whatcha doin'? Sure, he'd intended to find Sasuke so he could try to make friends with him first, but then he saw Sakura and Ino at the playground and just couldn't help himself. After all, if he had everything planned out right, there was still a little time before Itachi would make his move. He needed to relax a little anyway. The two girls shared a look. And Ino responded with a fair bit of hesitation. Our parents say we're not supposed to play with you. Oh yeah, that's definitely familiar. Can I ask why? The girls shrugged. Dad just said not to. Ino seemed to relax a little, turning to Sakura. What about your mom, Sakura? The pink-haired girl just shook her head, not uttering a word. Well, I guess she was pretty shy when she was little. Well, that ain't very fair. Can I hang around with you? I mean, you're just not supposed to play with me, right? So if I just kinda sit around it shouldn't be a big deal. Yeah, the blonde girl smiled at him. I guess that's true. My name's Ino, and that's, she pointed over at her companion. Sakura. I guess we hadn't really been formally introduced yet at this age. Yeah, I've seen you two at the academy. I'm Naruto. Uzumaki Naruto. Thanks for letting me stick around. Naruto grinned, scratching the back of his head. So what are you doing? Ino held up a small arrangement of colorful flowers. Showing Sakura how to make a wreath. What is it with girls and flowers? Seriously, he got the whole thing with giving him flowers for gifts, but for the life of him, Naruto couldn't figure out what was so special about the things. Well, okay, so maybe they were kind of nice to look at. Especially the orange ones. Orange was just awesome. And in their spare time, sometimes Sakura had taken to telling him about all the antidotes and poisons and things that medics could do with them, so they could actually be useful. Ino's face turned sour at the comment, and she settled on sending him a far too cute to be taken seriously glare. What is it with boys and getting all dirty and gross? While Ino chastised him, Sakura crossed her arms and matched Ino's expression towards the boy. It's fun. The girls let out a sigh, obviously sharing the same thought. Boys were stupid, plain and simple. So maybe he wasn't exactly a big fan of flowers or all this jewelry-making stuff, but hey, why not? So, how do you put these things together? Ino gave him an odd glance. We're not supposed to play with you, remember? Naruto was about to make an excuse, when Sakura spoke with a quiet voice. It's more like teaching though, right? So we're not really playing. Ino seemed to think it over, and Naruto grinned at Sakura. She always had been the smartest member of Team 7, so it was natural that she'd find a loophole. Naruto would have just said to ignore it. Sasuke, he couldn't honestly picture Sasuke even considering the issue worth his time. Yeah, Ino smiled at him again. That makes sense. Well, first you start B. Sakura. Ino. What do you two think you're doing? The three looked up to see a woman with pink hair glaring down at them. Or more accurately, glaring down at Naruto. Definitely Sakura's mom. Maybe he should have waited for a better time. Mom, what's what's wrong, me missy? Your father and I have already told you, we don't want you associating with him. She turned towards the other girl, both of them looking away with a cringe at the woman's voice. And you, Ino, what would your parents have to say? But mommy, we were just. I don't want to hear it. The woman was almost shouting, and Naruto winced at the tone. It reminded him way too much of an angry Sakura. Something that rarely ended well for him. You two are coming with me. Now. But, right, now. Not wanting to anger the woman any further, Ino and Sakura took her outstretched hands, looking back at their new friend with apologetic glances. He simply grinned at them. And gave a small wave before walking off in the other direction, as if Mrs. Haruno had simply told them it was time to go and that they could come back the next day. Well, that didn't go as well as he'd hoped. Now, evening was starting to make its way in, which meant he had more important business to attend to. His first, his only, order of business in the evenings was simple: Uchiha Itachi. Sasuke had never really gone into much detail on his past, and Naruto only managed to gather so much from those few others that had been willing to answer his questions. Itachi's madness had spiraled out of control and led to the destruction of his clan only after he'd supposedly murdered one of their cousins, Shisen, something. One of the unfortunate drawbacks to being rivals was that they never really had those heart-to-heart conversations unless it was in the middle of beating the living stuffing out of one another, and even if they hadn't spent more time fighting than talking, neither of them was honestly all that comfortable with talking about the things they'd been through. Still, he was pretty sure Sasuke had mentioned that it was around this time. Yeah, it was around this week. Or month. Or maybe it was this season. Damn it, he knew that it was this year, and he'd make sure it was stopped even if he had to patrol the entire village each and every day. With that mental declaration firmly established, Naruto settled himself and prepared to enter Sage mode. He wasn't particularly familiar with Itachi's chakra, but the Uchiha all tended to feel pretty similar, so it was easy to start sensing around areas that were more secluded. What else did he have to do with his time anyway? His ability to change things right now was limited by that whole, not a shinobi yet, thing. But there was still something he could do, and this was it. Lord Hokage. The brown-haired Chunin entered the room, shutting the door behind him. Ah, Iruka. You wished to speak with me about something. It's about Naruto. The Hokage sighed, not completely sure he wanted to know what Iruka had to say about that particular issue. More often than not, it was because the boy was causing some kind of trouble. Still, he was definitely an entertaining distraction. What has he gotten into this time? Well, it's not that he's really gotten into anything. He's actually been really well behaved the last several days. It wasn't coincidence that both of them were starting to wonder what the kid was planning. The young Uzumaki was never that well behaved. I suppose it has been rather quiet around the village. Far too quiet to be considered a good sign. This kind of calm, silent peace could only mean that a storm was coming. What is that boy up to this time? Oh well, he would have time to ponder later. For now, he needed to tend to Iruka's concerns. Well, if he's not in trouble, what's the problem? You check up on him pretty often, don't you, Lord Hokage? Iruka seemed a little worried. Which wasn't all that uncommon when it came to his student, but this seemed like genuine concern rather than just frustration over the child's attitude or what prank he might be planning next. I watch after him quite often. It can be hard not to, sometimes, with all of the attention he brings to himself. They both knew that it was more about protecting him than about watching his antics. Even if he had pulled off some pretty good jokes once in a while. Have noticed anything off about him? Just in the last few days, I mean. Well, he has been acting a little more reserved than usual, but it's not the first time. I suppose you still remember the incident at the Uchiha compound, correct? Iruka nodded at that. It was hard to forget how angry Fugaku, head of the Uchiha clan, had been at waking up to find every one of the clan's symbols orange and blue, including those on the police corps headquarters. What was Naruto's reaction? Totally worth it. But you don't believe this is the case. It was more of a statement than a question. The Hokage paused, thinking back over Naruto's recent activities. He was spending a considerable amount of time near the Uchiha compound yesterday. I suppose he could be planning another prank on the clan. That he was spending time around the Uchiha compound at all was worrying. Sarutobi believed the Uchiha, for the most part, were fine people. But Danzo would certainly be suspicious if the Kyuubi's Jinchuriki suddenly started spending time around the only group of people known to have a technique capable of controlling the Kyuubi itself. At least now that Mokuden was essentially extinct. He was already suspicious enough of the Uchiha as it was. Admittedly, while he couldn't agree with all of Danzo's beliefs, there was no denying that their talks with the leadership of the clan regarding possible re-evaluations of their current living conditions were quickly spiraling towards what seemed to be an unpleasant conclusion. I don't think so, Lord Hokage. I mean, he doesn't usually pull pranks that big very often, and definitely not on the same people. Not this close together. Yes, it would be quite unusual of him. Sarutobi stood. It's too late tonight, and I still have business to attend to. I'll speak with him tomorrow. I'm sure we can sort this out. As Iruka left, the third Hokage began to prepare for his later meeting with Danzo. He intended to get to the bottom of this rumored conspiracy that his old friend was so obsessed with, and hopefully he'd be able to reason with the paranoid, albeit with good reason, Warhawk. Nearly an hour later, Danzo entered the room without warning, coming to stand in front of the Hokage. Lord Hokage. The old rivals exchanged polite nods. This is in regards to the plans for the Uchiha, I presume. Danzo pulled a nearby chair in front of the Hokage's desk, and sat down to face his former friend. You assume correctly, Danzo. There is a problem, we both know that, but we must think about this rationally. We cannot act without considering the consequences first. If there is a conspiracy, the entire Uchiha clan cannot possibly be involved. If nothing else, I'm certain of the loyalties of at least a few of their people. We must weed out those behind the movement before making any decisions. And how, Lord Hokage, do you propose we do this? Itachi is the most effective spy we could hope to have placed within their inner circle. He is the son of the highest authority in their ranks, one of the most skilled shinobi in the village, and they believe that he is in fact acting as a spy on their behalf. If he has yet to uncover their secrets, then what more can we do? The Hokage held back a sigh, not wanting to show his frustration. This was getting nowhere. As Hokage, he didn't need Danzo's approval for anything. Still, their lives were too closely intertwined for him to simply ignore his advisement, no matter how they may have disagreed at times. In fact, it was one of the very reasons he sought the man's advice above all others. Kaharu and Homura voiced their disagreement often, but neither was willing to truly fight him on such matters. While he was proud to have their trust and respect, their history pushed it well beyond the line of even his title. They were too close to him. Danzo, on the other hand, perhaps he hadn't abandoned their friendship, somewhere in the depths of his heart. But neither would he restrain himself or his beliefs for the Hokage's sake. I plan to speak with Captain Fugaku of these suspicions. Surely we can come to some sort of understanding. Danzo leaned back in his chair, intertwining his fingers, and looked down at his clasped hands before speaking. I'm afraid it's too late for that, Lord Hokage. Hiruzen's eyes widened for a moment, only just a fraction. That anyone else might have missed. His expression rapidly settled into a dark grimace. Danzo knew that expression well. He wasn't dealing with the kindly old grandfather or the stern yet understanding mentor and comrade. This was the Hokage, pure and unhindered by emotion. This was the part of his old rival that he still respected. Danzo, what have you done? Only what needed to be done. Lord Hokage. Before the elderly man could question him further, they both turned, facing towards the Nakano River. It was impossible for either to miss the large flare of all too familiar chakra. Malicious and brutal, and there was only one person from whom it could have originated. Naruto. The Jinchuriki. Naruto had been walking through the forested area near the Nakano River when he'd found who he was looking for. He couldn't do anything at the time, seeing as he couldn't simply attack Itachi without reason, especially with someone else there to see it. So instead, he'd dropped to the ground and done something that had never really been his specialty. He waited. So boring. If it hadn't been so important, it wouldn't even be a question of whether or not he would stay. It would only be an issue of how long his incredibly limited patience would last. It was already dark out, and Itachi had been talking to the other man Shisui, that was his name. For several minutes when Naruto finally got the chance to act. Though admittedly, he hadn't honestly expected the chance to even arrive this week, much less this very day. He'd been staring into space, listening only half-heartedly, when he heard a sudden commotion from near the place they'd been standing. Leaping to his feet, he took a moment to appraise at the two. Apparently Itachi had caught the man by surprise, as he had a tight hold on him, and was forcing his head into the water nearby. With the knowledge that he didn't have much time firmly in place, Naruto figured he'd best begin to put his plan into action. Focusing on the power buried inside of the seal, he began to summon the Kyuubi's chakra. He doubted he could take Itachi at his current state, even with the help of the fox's energy. Itachi was practically a legend for a reason, and even if his body wasn't simply too young and underdeveloped, he still hadn't actually been able to outwit or overpower the man when he'd been older and more able. That didn't mean he was incapable of getting a good sucker punch in though. More importantly, using the beast's chakra would attract some attention. Specifically, it would attract the attention of the Hokage and Anbu. Who would be the deciding factor? After all, they would be coming fully equipped to deal with the Kyuubi, broken free of its seal, so they would certainly be equipped to deal with Itachi. And for all of his natural talent, This Itachi was also younger and less experienced, and missing the most powerful jutsu that his counterpart from the previous life had possessed. When he saw Itachi's head tilt his direction, his grasp on the other man loosening in surprise, Naruto charged. He must have looked the part of the demon that so many villagers insisted he was. With the orange-red chakra swirling around him like an inferno. He didn't want to pull too much, so a tailed transformation was out of the question, but he could at least add a little flair to the show. As he reached Itachi, he shot out his arm, hoping that between the surprise and his Kyuubi-enhanced strength, he could manage to stun the older boy. He was not disappointed. To Naruto's surprise, the punch connected with Itachi's jaw at full force, knocking him backwards into the river without so much as a hint of resistance. The older Uchiha pulled himself out of the water, and rolled on his back as he gasped for breath. Naruto was glad that he'd been able to stop the initial attack, but as Itachi stood, he couldn't fight the surge of anxiety that shot through his mind. This, Shisui, character was still out of it. At least for a little bit, and the element of surprise wasn't going to work to his advantage now that Itachi's focus had shifted to him. Come on people, what the hell? As pouring out the fox's chakra like a freaking waterfall. Where were the reinforcements? Having a few Anbu nearby, or hell, even a few random gate guards, would be nice about now. Seeing Itachi suddenly disappear, Naruto ducked in anticipation of the coming attack, but stayed near the coughing man's body. If Itachi was trying to kill him, it had to be his best friend. Killing your best friend was how Sasuke'd said that you achieved the Mangekyo Sharingan, after all. Itachi appeared behind him, a windmill shuriken raised above his head, and brought the weapon down. Naruto raised his arm and closed his eyes, anticipating the blow. Only to open them in surprise moments later when it didn't come. The Uchiha was staring, edge of the weapon resting mere centimeters from his target, but didn't make any further aggressive movements. Naruto didn't drop his defensive posture either, but even knowing what could happen, he couldn't resist the urge to look into the older shinobi's eyes. They'd only met a couple of times in his life. And one thing that Sasuke's elder brother had never been was expressive. Yet now he showed a clear expression of consideration, Sharingan focused right back on the red beast-like eyes. Both could feel the strange connection, a sort of interest, or perhaps something entirely different that Naruto probably couldn't even begin figure out. It didn't last for more than an instant, however. As Itachi's attention shifted to something in the distance, the Uchiha flipped backwards, just barely dodging a swarm of kunai, and surveyed the area for a moment. Naruto turned towards the source of the attack and felt his chest constrict. Kakashi-sensei. Itachi realized who it was as well, and knew it was time to leave. Kakashi of the Sharingan had arrived, Shisui of the body flicker was finally recovering and sending a heated expression towards his fellow Uchiha, while the Kyuubi's Jinchuriki stood protectively in front of the man, red chakra still swirling around his small form. Furthermore, it was obvious that there were going to be more shinobi arriving soon as well. Shisui, it seems we'll have to continue this another day. And as for you, Jinchuriki, both of the older men stilled at this. Apparently having failed to realize that Naruto was actually aware and in control of himself. Itachi closed his eyes, cocking his head to the side in an amused manner. No, I suppose it doesn't mean anything now. As he disappeared again, his body flickered more than fast enough to escape any pursuing shinobi that may have come to investigate, and Kakashi turned back towards Naruto and Shisui. Anyone care to explain just what the hell is going on here? He was strangely calm for a man who'd been involved in the battle with the Kyuubi, and who'd lost a close friend and mentor of his own to the beast that was currently trapped in the boy in front of him. As Shisui stood, preparing to explain, Naruto felt his consciousness slipping away, and dropped to the ground moments later. After moving to check on the boy, and finding that he was simply asleep, Shisui turned to the older shinobi. Itachi attacked me. The kid, he saved my life. Boy. Nothing. Child. Not a twitch. Kit. What had he called him before? Spawn. Nope. Midday snack. Fun, but not insulting enough. Brat. Too cliché. Awaken this instant, you damnable scum-ridden worthless piece of piss-furred filth. Yep. That was the ticket. Say wa. Naruto sat up, quickly realizing that he was back in front of the Kyuubi's cage. He rubbed at his eyes for a second, and took a slow look arrow. before they came to rest on the creature in front of him once again. He was spending a surprisingly large amount of time here lately. Hey Fuzzy-chan, you're looking better. And he was. He'd gotten bigger. Though still not nearly as massive as he'd once been, and he had two tails rather than the one he'd had before. His fur was less patchy, and his flesh didn't stretch so tightly against the bone. Naruto couldn't even act surprised. Its biggest impact on him over the years was its regenerative abilities, after all. It made sense that the fox would replenish its energy pretty quickly. Not that this had stopped him from taunting the demon by referring to him as a Fuzzy-chan more and more often. How many times have you awakened me from my slumber at this point? And now when you find the time in your busy schedule to waste my own, you decide to take a little nap. What is it that you want? Speak and be gone. Don't know. I just kinda passed out, and here we are. Passed out? You weren't gone for that long. What could you possibly do that would be nearly exhaustive enough to make you pass out? Hey, it's been a couple of days. That's plenty, a time for me to get into some kind of mess. You really weren't kidding when you said we had a tendency to get in trouble. Told ya. You don't seem surprised to be here. Has this happened before? Let's see, yeah, it's happened once or twice. When I get hurt or something, I'll usually pop in and you'll load me up with chakra. All great shinobi say chakra. Anyway, you'll give me chakra, till I can smash whatever's causing the problem. I see. So in summary, you truly are an idiot. Naruto went on, ignoring the question entirely. Anyway, I actually do have something to ask you about. Well normally, when I use the chakra, I thought all great shinobi said chakra. Quote. Shut up Fuzzy-chan. Anyway, normally I'm fine. But this time when I used it, I only did it for a few minutes before the lights went out. I don't get it. Any ideas? The Kyuubi let out a sigh. How did even its sighs manage to sound like roars? Obviously expecting the question, and responding with a slow, exasperated voice that was normally reserved for small children. Your body is younger, even if your mind is not. If you truly do have such access to my chakra, it's bound to cause a serious strain on your body. Pump my chakra into a flea and see what happens. A flea, huh? An accurate enough analogy, given your remarkable stature. That's a crack at my height, isn't it? It can learn. Will wonders never cease? Hey, it's not my fault I didn't get too much food as a kid. And you're making me get off track. So basically, without the training and stuff that I had before, that little bit was still too much, right? Did I not just get finished explaining that? Perhaps I should consider smaller words next time. Wheel crap. I figured that this might happen, I just didn't expect it such a small amount to push the limit. You've realized that you're a bumbling fool who overestimates his own abilities. How wonderful. Now get out. They sat in an awkward silence for a few minutes, either really knowing what to talk about, or in the cube's case, simply not wanting to do anything remotely close to socializing with a human, especially this human. On the other hand, Naruto had never liked these silences. So naturally he decided to break it. So, how's the weather been in here? Now if only he'd been any good at small talk. Dark, rainy, and full of fog. What does that tell you? I've been sleeping a lot. You're a talentless fool whose greatest achievement in life is his inability to stop wasting the breathing space of everything else around him. Now leave me be. I'll have much rest ahead before I can regain my strength, especially with a certain individual drawing on my power every time it needs to move a leaf. Gotcha. Later, Fuzzy-chan. And stop calling me that. Moments later, Naruto's eyes began to open, and he quickly shut them again in a futile attempt to block out the bright lights overhead. He put an arm over his eyes, and began to slide them again more slowly, allowing them to adjust to the light change. Everything was white. Way too white. Definitely in the hospital. Feeling a strange weight on the opposite end of the bed, he sat up and looked forward. Only to come face to face with the boy that Itachi had been meeting with so often. The older boy was sitting cross-legged on the end of his bed, staring intently at the young Jinchuriki across from him. Creepy. I'm telling you, their whole family is freaking creepy. What's up? You saved my life. Yeah, guess so. What, was that something strange? Yeah, they thought he was a monster. But they really wouldn't expect him to save somebody from being drowned. He's not getting over that one, is he? Yep, me. And who the heck are you? Shisui. Why? Naruto shrugged at the question. It wasn't as though he could be very honest in this situation. I dunno. 'Cause you looked like you needed it. Shisui fixed him with an odd stare. So what was that strange chakra you were using? Huh, it was my natural chakra. Crap. It wasn't technically a lie considering he'd had it since not long after he was born, but it sure wasn't a satisfying explanation. Shisui's stare became more thoughtful. And a tad more suspicious. Chakra isn't visible. Not normally, anyway. I could see yours clearly even without my Sharingan, and it looked a lot like something from the Shisui-san. The voice of the third Hokage spoke from the doorway, a clear hint of warning in his voice that anyone who knew him would recognize. Still, even though the tone held a touch of warning, the grandfatherly smile remained etched on his features. I need to speak with our young guest. If you could kindly give us a moment, it would be highly appreciated. The old man stepped forward into the room, followed by the man Shisui recognized as Captain Hitaki. Shisui nodded, pushing himself off the foot of the bed and giving the Hokage a small bow before walking from the room, shutting the door behind him. Kakashi watched the door for a moment, lifting the headband to use the Sharingan eye that Naruto now knew he concealed behind the leaf symbol, before turning to the Hokage and giving him a nod. Clear. The Hokage returned the nod, and turned to Naruto with a smile. Hello, Naruto-kun. How are you feeling? Naruto grunted half-heartedly. Like crap. I hate hospitals, old man. Thought you'd know that by now. You hate hospitals. Whatever for. Free food, friendly neighbors, young, pretty nurses with such short skirts. The Hokage seemed to drift into his own world, and Kakashi gave a slight cough. Naruto scoffed. Oh please. The food sucks even if it is free, the friendly neighbors are smelly old people, boring grown-ups, and not friendly, everyone else. You've got me on the nurses though, Gramps. Wait, am I supposed to be too little to notice that kinda thing right now? Oh, yes. He focused on Naruto again. My apologies. I'm afraid I drifted off for a moment there. I must be getting older than I thought. Naruto gave him a skeptical stare. PFF'd. Driftin' off 'cause of your age my ass, you dirty old man. Just wait till ya see my improved sexy jutsu sets, and we'll see if it's just your old age distracting you so much. Anyway, I needed to speak to you about the events of last evening. Last evening? What d'ya mean by last night, exactly? What time is it? Oh, about 3 in the afternoon. Quote. 3. Oh man, Ruruka-sensei is gonna kill me. Don't worry. I mean I'm late a lot, but man. Naruto, I'm trying to tell you that I'm so dead. Giving up on grabbing his attention. The Hokage waited until Naruto finally had to take a breath before clearing his throat. Once he had the boy's attention, he continued. I've already spoken with Iruka. Don't worry, you've been excused. For a moment Naruto looked relieved, but then he was upset all over again. Aw man, I wasted an entire day of vacation in bed. What a rip-off. Naruto, the Hokage's tone turned serious. All of this aside, we have some very important matters to discuss with you. Okay. He turned to Kakashi, as if just noticing him, and began pointing his finger at the man. Hey, it's the masked pervert. Naruto-kun, the boy looked to him. It would be appropriate to address him as Captain Hitaki, or if you must, Hitaki-san. Though, masked pervert, is also quite fitting. The Hokage thought with a hidden smile. Oh, okay. Naruto turned back to the Anbu captain. How you doing, Captain Masked Pervert-san? As the third Hokage laughed, he somehow felt he should have seen that coming. Respect had never been Naruto's strongest point. Still, he was quick to pull himself together. We need to put a stop to this. I can't allow us to continue getting distracted. Naruto-kun, we need to stop playing games. There is a very serious matter to discuss about recent events. Naruto frowned and sat up, crossing his arms. The third was honestly surprised. He rarely saw Naruto being so serious about something. Anything, really. So what do you want, Gramps? What do you recall about last night? I need to know everything that you can remember about what occurred with Shisui and Itachi Uchiha. Oh, you mean the guy who was in here before? Nothing much. The other guy attacked him, then I just kind of blanked out." He paused as if he were trying to think of something. "Nope, that's about it. Then I woke up here. You don't recall anything unusual? For example, a strange light, or some strange feelings? Anger, or perhaps a hunger of some kind?" Naruto glanced back and forth between Kakashi, who was leaning against the wall and looking towards the door, and the Hokage. After a few seconds, he decided that he might as well tell them that he knew about the fox. T'd certainly make trying to keep them from getting suspicious about the things he did a bit easier. "Oh, you mean Fuzzy-chan?" The Hokage's expression didn't change much, but Kakashi's head tilted towards him, clearly more interested than before. "Pardon me, but who or what is this, Fuzzy-chan that you speaking of?" "Well, there's dogs, raccoons, I guess bears are probably kind of fuzzy, and there's ALS. Naruto." The third frowned slightly, obviously not pleased with Naruto's little joke. Okay, Fuzzy-chan, you know, the big fox thing that lives in my head. Or my gut really, if you think about it. That's where he said the seal is. Freaking hates it when I call him that, but he always calls me a rodent or a hairless monkey or things like that. The big fox that," the Hokage cut off, closing his eyes and rubbing the bridge of his nose, trying to gather his thoughts. "The Kyuubi has contacted Naruto somehow. That can't be a good sign. Yet it doesn't seem to have influenced him. But he clearly used its chakra." "Naruto-kun," he started again, unsure of precisely how to phrase his question. "What kind of contact do you have with this, Fuzzy-chan?" "Not a lot. I mean, we talk now and then. But he mostly just says how he wants to eat me and stuff. He's a pretty funny old furball when he gets mad. Oh, and he said something about letting me have his chakra when I was in trouble, but chakra, actually." The Hokage corrected him absent-mindedly, reevaluating Naruto's situation. So the Kyuubi had actually allowed him to access its chakra because he was in danger. He wasn't as amazing with sealing as Minato had once been, but surely the seal must have had something to do with it. Based on their knowledge of the Kyuubi, it wouldn't simply do something to help another of its own free will. It must have viewed a threat to Naruto as a threat to its own life, or whatever it had that resembled a life after being sealed away. "But you don't feel anything odd?" Kakashi spoke up for the first time, surprising Naruto. "No bloodlust, no anger, you don't want to attack anything?" Nah, nothing like that. I mean one time I did go running after a big tanuki all covered in sand and I've got this thing with snakes, but I think that's all more me than him." "Why should I?" No. Kakashi reached into the pocket of his vest, pulling out a small book that Naruto would recognize anywhere by now. "You seem to be fine." The Hokage had to agree. While he doubted the Danzo or any of the others would feel the same, Naruto did seem to be unaffected by the Kyuubi. Or, at the least, he showed no signs of being influenced any time in the near future. He would suggest that Danzo leave the boy alone for now. "Very well, Naruto-kun. Perhaps you should get some more rest. Kakashi, if you would escort our young friend home." Kakashi nodded, and gave a small bow of his head as the third Hokage left the room, intent on having a word with his childhood rival about the Jinchuriki and the actions of Itachi Uchiha. This complicates things considerably. Fugaku Uchiha was speaking with the other leaders of the clan, pondering the impact of the recent events on their revolution. "We'll have to put our plans on hold. But Fugaku-sama, we've come so far. And in a matter of hours, we've lost too much." Fugaku was getting tired of this discussion. Itachi clearly wasn't going to be helping them. It would seem their suspicions regarding his eldest son's true loyalties might have been truer than they had hoped. He closed his eyes, waiting for yet another objection. "Fugaku-sama is right." Another of them spoke up. "We can't even let Shisui-san in on our plans now. You know how he adored the traitor, and he's always been one of the most loyal to Konoha. If we to go to him now, he probably won't believe anything we have to say." "Indeed." Fugaku opened his eyes again, pleased that someone else understood. "Itachi has betrayed us. And without Shisui, we've lost two of our greatest warriors. To make matters worse, it is now quite clear that Danzo and the Hokage know of, or at least suspect, our intentions. Does anyone here truly believe that we can defeat them? As well as all of their supporters, with one of our greatest shinobi missing and when another might turn against us if we move too quickly?" There were no objections this time. So it's agreed, then. The man who'd supported Fugaku moments ago spoke up. For the time being, we agree to listen to what the Hokage has to say, and begin building our strength again. That is my decision. As the remainder of the clan's leaders reluctantly agreed, Fugaku dismissed them, and prepared to return to Makoto and Sasuke. They'd agreed to tell Sasuke together. Hopefully, he wouldn't take his brother's departure too severely. His hopes weren't high though, given their youngest son's adoration of their eldest. But their plans weren't the only ones that required rethinking after that night. Well, this is a bit of a setback. Itachi nodded in agreement, watching over Konohagakure from a distance, glancing at the odd orange mask with the black markings. Madara seemed strangely calm considering the fact that his traitorous family wasn't being destroyed as he'd expected. Not to mention that his partner had been interrupted before he could perform the task that would have earned him the Mangekyo Sharingan. No doubt throwing a massive wrench into both of their plans. Oh well, you did a pretty good job, even if things didn't go quite according to plan. I think we can make this work. Itachi's head tilted slightly, and Madara assumed this was curiosity. He was certain his descendant would be trying to figure out his intentions. Despite what the younger Uchiha seemed to think, his Acton G would never fool someone with Madara's experience. He knew the child was working in Konohagakure's best interests, and that despite making Madara promise to leave the village alone, the former Uchiha, a clan leader would make a strike against their former home eventually. Well, we know that the Kyuubi's Jinchuriki can access its chakra, whether it was intentional or not. And with the rest of the clan around to stir up trouble, Konoha's leadership will have more on its table to keep them busy. Besides, there are still certain people who would be very interested in having the Sharingan for themselves. I'm sure he could make things a little less stable. It is one of his favorite hobbies, after all. He must have been talking about Orochimaru. Itachi had only been in very limited contact with the Serpentine member of the Sannin. But his obsession with the Uchiha's special genetic trait was obvious to anyone with eyes or ears. Yes, Madara smiled behind the mask. I think we can make this work very well. 3 years. It had been 3 years since he'd come back through time. He had to say, he was disappointed with the lack of changes he'd been able to make. Unfortunately, there wasn't a whole lot to change until he was older. He'd stopped the Uchiha massacre, but somehow, he had a bad feeling about what that might have caused. He couldn't explain it, but something just seemed off. Sasuke was, well, to be honest, he was the same with a tad bit more arrogance and a lot less anger. And he still wasn't that fond of Naruto, despite his best attempts to make friends with the dark-haired boy. He wasn't cruel, of course. But he just didn't seem to care about what he did. No, he hadn't really paid any attention to Naruto before until they'd been put on the same team, and Naruto hadn't wanted him to at the time. But having the closest thing he'd ever had to a best friend look at him with nothing more than slight curiosity wasn't quite the greatest feeling he'd ever had. On the other hand, while they weren't exactly friends, Sasuke seemed to acknowledge him much more than he had in Naruto's memories. Sure, he still had a tendency to sleep and not pay attention during class, but now it was more out of boredom than out of a lack of knowledge or skill. Iruka had been pleasantly surprised at Naruto's rather advanced skill for someone his age, even though they hadn't really been given a chance to display much aside from the basics, and Sasuke seemed to be thrilled with the idea that there was someone else in their class who was above the bar, so to speak. He was glad to know that whenever a chance came up in class, Sasuke was never one to reject him as a sparring partner. But still, he wanted his rival back, not just a rival. He hadn't exactly increased in standing among the villagers either. But then, he was still up to the pranks he'd been so fond of in his own timeline, only now he could pull them off with more efficiency. To no one's surprise, this increase in skill for being an obnoxious little brat annoyed the villagers even more. He'd managed to befriend Sakura and Ino, though, at least. They weren't technically allowed to spend time with him, but their parents simply couldn't watch their children all of the time, and Naruto was far more skilled at getting moments alone with them than his attitude and appearance would imply. Of course, most of his relationships with those from before hadn't changed much. Shikamaru, Choji, and Kiba had never really had a problem with him in the first place. Even before they'd gladly spent time with him if he happened to be around. Choji was overly friendly and sympathized with Naruto's huge appetite. Kiba had always liked to rebel against what his parents told him to do, and Shikamaru, well, Shikamaru just foo. Leaving whenever he happened to be around far too troublesome. Shino had always been freakishly quiet and reserved, and he'd probably be that way until the day they all died, so Naruto hadn't expected much from him. It was only once he really started paying attention that he realized Shino had never bothered to leave when his louder classmate was nearby, and none of his family had ever stopped him from playing, which to Shino apparently consisted of standing around and watching with the Jinchuriki. Still, quiet or not, it was who he was, and Naruto probably wouldn't have it any other way. Hinata's relationship with him hadn't exactly changed much either. Sure, he spoke to her more often, and tried to include her in things sometimes. It wasn't that he didn't want to be friends with her or something like that. He just wasn't sure how to do it without being awkward. He'd learned not long before their final battle that the reason why she'd always been so weird, God, he felt like such an idiot. Looking back on all those times around him was because she'd actually had a crush on him. While she'd never actually come out and said it, he was pretty certain that it had reached an ocean far deeper and more complex than a mere crush. And he really sucked at those big emotional talks. The most emotional his discussions had ever gotten were his fights with Sasuke, and those usually involved him being so desperate and enraged that he couldn't remember much of what he'd said afterwards. Anyway, he wasn't going to just sit by and ignore her like the last time. He wasn't sure where they stood or where they would stand later, but she had still been among his closest friends and the one of the first to genuinely support him, and he wasn't going to treat her like anything less. As for most of his older allies, such as Kakashi, he rarely saw them. It wasn't for lack of trying by any stretch. He had no trouble trying to track them down and harass them on occasion, but most of the adult shinobi were simply too busy. Going on missions and training genin was a pretty full-time job, after all. He'd also become surprisingly fond of one Shisui Uchiha. As with most of his elders, Shisui didn't exactly have an exceptionally large amount of free time. But he had occasionally treated Naruto to a meal, or given him pointers when he caught him training, even if most of O's pointers were things that he was already well aware of, and generally just consisted of correcting mistakes that he'd made intentionally. Then again, even if he didn't really need the advice, fact was that he'd managed to make a friend out of the older boy. And more friends was never a drawback as far as he was concerned. On another unpleasant note, he'd apparently been wrong about Gaara coming back as well. He'd attempted to write the boy a letter not too long after he'd stopped Itachi, and had never received a response. He supposed that it might have been due to one of the messengers losing the letter. The messenger birds weren't always perfect, no matter how flawless they seemed at times, or that it might have been unwilling to pass it through the hands of humans who may have reported it to the Hokage or Kazekage, but he doubted it. Even if he usually didn't leave much of an indication that he was the one writing it, problems could still occur. Besides, he wasn't exact Ly experienced with using more normal animals to deliver things. He'd almost always relied on the toads for that kind of work before, and summoning a toad wasn't a good idea now for several obvious reasons. As for Ino, well, she hadn't given any signs of being dragged back either, so the only real conclusion he'd been able to reach was that it must have been his imagination. Who knew what kind of crazy stuff a person felt and saw as they were dying and being sent back through time? There wasn't much of a precedent for these things. Deciding not to ponder the events that had occurred over the last couple of years any further, Naruto directed his attention to Iruka, before leaning back in his chair. With a quiet sigh, he leaned back and let out a loud groan. Bored. Sasuke, seated on Sakura's other side, was compelled to silently agree with the blonde boy. When they'd been younger, he'd firmly believed that the loudmouth was nothing but a prank-pulling loser and idiot, but Naruto had surprised him when he'd actually been pretty decent at their taijutsu lessons, if one could call them that. He'd long since learned most of what they'd taught their class so far in the academy. He was at the very top of the class, as if any self-respecting Uchiha would do less, and they'd even considered allowing him to advance further, though apparently he hadn't been quite that good. He Had his suspicions that it was more due to what had happened the last time someone in his immediate family had advanced and graduated near his age, but he didn't really have any actual evidence that this was the case. Sakura, on the other hand, didn't agree with Naruto's exclamation. In fact, she was fascinated with just about everything Iruka told them. She knew that she wasn't as good as Naruto or Sasuke. They were at the top of the class when it came to the physical aspects of training, but knowledge and technique were her specialty. Letting out her own sigh, she thumped Naruto on the nose. And watched with amusement as he nearly fell backwards out of his chair. He's just so adorably oblivious. Naruto-kun, shush. I'm trying to hear what Iruka-sensei is saying. But Sakura-chan, I'm bored. Endearing as his lack of awareness might have been, his whining was very much the opposite. You should listen to her, idiot. Sakura's face reddened slightly at his support. A few years back, before she and Ino had gone crazy for Sasuke, she might have said something about him calling Naruto things like idiot or loser. After their crushes on him had first developed, she'd been too focused on Sasuke to really take note of it. But by now she'd realized that more often than not, it was a term of endearment rather than an actual insult. A sort of special title for his only real competition for the top spot. Not that either of the stubborn, bullheaded, ego-driven boys would actually admit it. Thanks Sasuke-kun. Naruto stuck his tongue out the duo, before folding his arms on the desk and resting his chin on them. Staring at the board Iruka was writing on with a disinterested gaze. They were learning actual jutsu more and more often these days, though they still focused primarily on concepts. And Naruto was eagerly waiting for the time to come when they'd be able to really cut loose in training. Of course there were a few things that he would have to hold back on, since using the Rasengan would probably attract a tiny, itsy-bitsy, minuscule amount of suspicion, but at least he'd finally be able to have some fun in the classes instead of half-heartedly going through the motions. An hour later, when they were finally released for the rest of the day, Naruto resisted the urge to run out of the room as fast as possible, and waited for Sakura to finish putting up the notes she always took. He'd always liked that whole smart and studious thing she'd had going on. Even if he didn't actually understand everything she'd told him about when she explained those things to him. Or, when he wasn't paying attention to what she was telling him, and just plain listening so he could spend time with her. So, you guys wanna get something to eat? Sasuke scoffed, and began to walk away. I need to get some real training in before the day is up. This place is hurting my progress more than it helps. Sorry Naruto-kun, but I promised my mom I'd help around the shop today. That's right. They do own one of those little antique stores or something, don't they? Guess I've gotta find someone other than my favorite girl and my favorite girl who doesn't wanna admit she's a girl to go to lunch with. He looked pointedly at Sasuke, who was just barely through the door as he said it, though he was apparently still close enough to send a one-fingered salute back at his classmate. Sakura tried to cover her quick laugh with a cough, and took on an admonishing tone. Naruto, you shouldn't make fun of him like that. What? It's not my fault. Maybe if he didn't spend so much me trying to look like such a pretty boy, I wouldn't call him a girl. Honestly, how many guys out there are really more girly than him? Besides Haku, and Itachi, and sometimes Sai, and a couple of those other guys from the Akatsuki. And then I guess Orochimaru was using a girl's body for a while, so he was pretty girly. There was also, I never really noticed how many girly guys I knew before. Weird. I think you're just jealous because all of us girls love him so much. And what's up with that? Seriously, you're all head over heels for a guy as girly as you are. Maybe even more girly. It just doesn't make sense. She finished packing with another laugh, and patted him on the shoulder as she headed for the door. You're so hopeless. I'll see you tomorrow, Naruto-kun. See ya later, Sakura-chan. Man, I need food. He rushed out of the building, and spotted Ino not too far away. Maybe she'll be free. Hey Ino-chan. She paused as he caught up to her, giving him an amused smile as he hopped from foot to foot. Wanna get some ramen? Ew, gross. No way. Do you have any idea how much that'd throw off my diet? Damn it, what's with these girls and those stupid diets? They're not anywhere close to being fat. Oh come on. Ramen is the perfect food. So many flavors, and so cheap, and not happening, Naruto. Oh, fine. Have it your way. He let out an overdramatic sigh. I guess I'll have to eat lunch all alone. It's fine, it's fine. I know that nobody loves me. She rolled her eyes at that. Oh, stop being so melodramatic. If it'll get you off my back, I'll have a bowl with you tomorrow. She held up one finger. One bowl. But I really do have something I've gotta do today. Sorry. Okay, if you say so. I'll hold ya to it, flower girl. After they parted ways, he wandered around for a few minutes before deciding to just go have some cup ramen at his apartment. His favorite frog wallet, or Gama-chan, as he so liked to call it, was a bit too empty for his tastes. The loss. Tea time he'd been so low on cash was when Jiraiya, anyway, he had plenty of food in his kitchen. Plus, he could use some meditation time. He despised meditation, but Fukasaku had insisted that it was necessary for properly mastering sage arts, and the old toads knew what they were talking about. Well, better get to it. Sunagaker. Gaara of the desert clutched his chest, breaths harsh and coming as he stood from his kneeling position. Thousands of thoughts racing through his mind at once. He'd been sitting in his room silently awaiting the cage's orders, when he'd nearly passed out from a combination of shock and pain unlike any he'd felt before. Now, as he tried to understand what was happening, memories of the last 16 years were flashing in his head. He knew he was a child. It was impossible not to notice how incredibly small his body was in comparison to the last time he'd seen his reflection. But then how did he have memories of something that hadn't happened? He didn't sleep, so he knew it couldn't be some kind of dream. A hallucination maybe, but despite the evidence all around him, he was certain that the memories weren't false. He tried to calm himself, shifting through his thoughts at a calmer pace, and searched for the most recent of his elder memories. His eyes widened slightly as he recalled what had happened. I was kneeling next to Naruto, and we'd been fighting those men from the Akatsuki. I was watching to make sure nothing came any closer to Naruto's body, and, what? I felt some kind of jolt, and there was a sort of orange or red light, then I was here. Here. But where is here? It's my room, or it's what used to be my room. And I was waiting for the cage, but how was I waiting for the cage if I was just beside Naruto, after the cage was long dead? And a thought passed through his mind, almost unbelievable, but still somehow feasible given what he was looking at with his own two eyes. It was just about the only explanation he could come up with as to how he suddenly found himself years younger, and in such a bizarre mental state. The past. How? He recalled the strange light again, connecting it with a chakra he'd once seen. Naruto, no, not Naruto. The Kyuubi. Did the Kyuubi do something? And something even more important crossed his mind. Naruto. If the Kyuubi did something, where is Naruto? Could he still be alive? Before he could consider the possibilities further, his door cracked open, and his sister peered in the door slowly, moving as if she were actually afraid of something. But then, if he really was in the past, he'd been quite the monster at this age. Her fear would be quite understandable if that was the case. Gaara, the cage has a mission for you. She began to pull back and shut the door, not wanting to do anything that might annoy her somewhat psychotic younger brother, when the boy's voice stopped her in her tracks. Tamari. She turned back to him, trying not to look as worried as she really was. Thank you. Her eyes widened in shock. Gaara had never thanked her. He'd never thanked anyone, actually. Most of what he said, if he even said anything at all, was to insult, reprimand, or threaten people. To put it lightly, she was utterly baffled at this unexpected action, but not quite baffled enough to ignore it, and possibly send him into one of his moods. Why, you're welcome, Gaara. As he heard her footsteps moving down the hall, and eventually fading, he began to examine his room, hoping for some kind of clues as to exactly what day it was, or if anything was out of the usual. He doubted it would be difficult to find if there was something. Even after Naruto's intervention in his life, he'd never been a fan of things that were grand and flashy. His room barely had anything non-essential. A small bed, a small dresser for the few things he actually had an interest in owning, a calendar that he had no need for, as he had nothing that was worth remembering. The calendar would be useless. He'd never even touched the thing, so it wouldn't be on the correct month anyway, and if it wasn't even on the right month, he doubted there would be anything indicating the day. Still, He flipped through it for the sake of being thorough, and noticed something early on. In small, slightly sloppy writing, were the words, "Got a letter." He'd never written that before, at least not in any memories that he could recall, none of his original memories, anyway. Not willing to take the time to dig through his mind for the event, he began searching through the dresser, pulling out clothes, blankets, and anything else he could find. As he did, a small, folded, rather plain piece of paper fell out. Checking the hall to make sure no one was nearby, he shut the door and unfolded the letter carefully, finding himself relieved when he discovered that it was what he was looking for. His eyes skimmed over the page, taking in the short message. "I don't know if you know me, but this is Naruto. If you know what I'm talking about, you'll know where to send anything you have to say. If not, then I guess I'm screwed, and this whole thing was just me going crazy. I hope I'm right. Right. I guess I'll just say bye then, Gaara." Gaara couldn't help but smile at the blonde's note, though the expression faded when he realized that it had probably come quite some time before. If Naruto had woken up at the same time he had, then it would have been completely impossible for him to send this message so quickly, and he definitely wouldn't have shoved it in a dresser. The only thing he could think of was that, since he was simply near Naruto and not Naruto himself, he must not have been thrown back as far in time. Back in time. It was so strange to say, but he was almost certain that, unless he'd simply gone insane, that was what had happened. He folded the paper, and replaced everything in his dresser. He would report to the cage, as was expected of him, but as soon as he was finished with whatever mission awaited him, he would have to make an attempt at getting word to Naruto. Naruto sat in a meditative pose, eyes closed, body relaxed and still. The world seemed to fade away as he began to feel the connection with nature, its power just at his fingertips. And then the accursed furball had to chime in with its opinion. "So I take it you didn't get to do whatever it was. As you were trying to do that you obviously failed to do because you're not doing it." Naruto sighed and gave the Kyuubi a sort of annoyed stare. The Kyuubi had been acting strange over the last few years. Maybe it was just because he'd never gone and spoken with it unless he needed some chakra before, or maybe it was just cheerful about having finally regained a fair bit of the chakra it had used to send them back. But the giant fox had been unusually chatty over the last few years. "Since when were you ever interested in my life? What else do I have to do? Honestly, I don't have that many other options for entertainment. You think your head is a thrilling place to spend hundreds of days each year. In countless millennia, never have I been so lacking in activity that I would actually enjoy. Why watching mold spread across your useless skull cage? And ya just happened to feel like talking as soon as I started trying to meditate, right? A coincidence, I assure you. It's inconceivable that I would ever want to interrupt you when you're busy with the trivial hairless ape nonsense that you little cretins get up to when you need to waste your absurdly short lives. Jackass. Insect. Seriously though, shut it. I need to do this whole meditation thing if I want to get stronger. And unless you want to go and send us back in time again because we died again because you interrupted me again, then you'll stop bothering me. Would it not be considerably easier to just rely on my power? The last time, I just relied on your power, I got blown in half and sent back in time. Not to mention all the times you've tried to break out while I was using your chakra. It didn't seem to pay any attention to that last part. Ah yes, the Uchiha. I look forward to the day we finally meet again. We have words to exchange. You shouldn't. Last time, that freakish eye of his made you damn near useless. I suppose it would present a rather significant advantage for one such as him. Perhaps less so if I had any idea what happened that day. Yet another annoying problem. Despite having been the one to send them back in time, even the Kyuubi didn't seem to remember anything. Or at least, it didn't remember anything too important. It often claimed to remember feelings or thoughts, but nothing especially solid. And besides, if this toad training is supposed to make you so powerful, why did it not help last time? I kinda didn't finish my training. That had definitely been one of the more idiotic decisions in his life. He'd only just mastered gathering the energy and learned that he couldn't even use it for more than a few minutes if he was moving when everything went to hell, and he'd skipped out on the rest of his training to jump back into the fray. I see. And who was it that taught you these skills? Man, Why's he so curious all of a sudden? I learned from Fukasaku. He's one of the toad sages. Yes, I know of them. They're nothing compared to we-tailed beasts. But they are rather impressive for lesser creatures. If nothing else, they're certainly more of a thrill to crush beneath one's feet than humans. Oh, and who was it that sealed you away again? Oh yeah, I remember. It was us, weak, worthless little insects that locked you up. Insolent little kit. Though I will admit some of you aren't completely useless trash. Your fourth Hokage was as stubborn as you. And there was one clan in particular that had a talent for causing me no end of frustration. Naruto chuckled. No doubt the Kyuubi was still sore about the manipulations of the Sharingan Wi. Elders that had once used it as little more than a puppet. Aw shucks. You're not half bad either, Fuzzy-chan. Now quiet down. I've got meditating to do. Fine. If it will keep you from getting us killed again. Then I shall leave you to your, this. Brat. And lay off the Uchiha insults, would ya? Hoping that the Kyuubi would do as he said, Naruto closed his eyes again, and returned to his meditative state. Returning to his attempt to connect with the natural energy around him. I simply don't understand how you can tolerate that boy. Just shut up already. Uchiha compound. I don't know how you can stand that boy. Ignoring his mother's complaints about Naruto, Sasuke rolled to the left as her fist slammed into the ground where his head had just been, cracking the hardwood floor. Slipping a kunai from his leg holster, he flung it towards her and flipped to his feet. As Makoto leaned back to dodge it, her hand shot out, catching the tip of the blade between her fingers. Sasuke had really gotten his bearings back when his kunai came to stop at his neck, and he raised his hands in defeat. He knew well enough that at this stage he wasn't going to be able to recover from this positio. And to defeat someone like Makoto or Fugaku, and since he happened to be sparring with one of them, he had no intention of trying. For an idiot, he's not that bad. He's loud, obnoxious, and he never shuts up. But I don't get why you hate him so much. She ignored him and held out his kunai, paying no attention to the frown he gave her as he plucked it from her fingers and tossed it in the air a few times before sliding it back into the holster. Your father should be back soon. He'll want to go over a new jutsu with you. You're not telling me something. We've already discussed this, Sasuke-kun. She let out a sigh. Both of them knowing where the conversation would end. He had never really stopped hounding them about their attitudes towards the boy, and it had gotten even worse after Itachi had left. The only thing that gave them any comfort in the matter was that Sasuke didn't know any of the true details regarding Itachi's betrayal, only that he had attacked their cousin and left several times. And you still won't tell me. Why do so many people hate him? You know how he acts. The rudeness, the constant pranks, There are plenty of people as rude as him, and his pranks are mostly harmless. Hell, aren't most shinobi parents usually happy if their kids manage to get away with that kind of harmless stuff? There's got to be more to it than that. Just stop. Some things are better left unsaid. And this is one of them. Fine, I'm going to go find father. But I will figure it out sooner or later. I don't like being lied to, and all of you have been doing it for years. Leaving the training room, he prepared to go to the outdoor training grounds of the Uchiha compound, more fit for ninjutsu training than the indoor practice facilities, still pondering the reasons why one Uzumaki Naruto was so highly disliked among the residents of Konoha. He hadn't noticed when they were just children, but around 4 years earlier he'd started realizing that his classmate Simi did get an excessive amount of anger thrown his way, far more than his simple and childish jokes should have brought on him. What bothered him the most was that his parents, who he'd never noticed giving any real attention to the boy, had suddenly started treating him nearly the same as the rest of the villagers not long after Itachi had attacked their cousin. There had to be a connection. It was just a matter of uncovering it. Sunagaku. Something about her little brother was different. Kankuro said that it was probably just the usual lust for blood kicking in at a convenient moment, but she couldn't force herself to believe it. It was just too wrong, somehow, to have only been his typical urge to slaughter. It had just been a standard C-rank mission for the trio. They were assigned to eliminate a small group of criminals holed up in a cave a few miles from the village that had been harassing the local traders. What they hadn't known was that several former shinobi had taken up residence in the caves as well, and seemed to specialize in using weapons laced with various types of venoms and poisons. To make it worse, their targets had been warned that they were coming and were more than prepared. Still, even with the unexpected additions to the enemy's forces and the ambush, it wouldn't have normally been anything they couldn't handle. And then she'd nearly been hit from behind. Dee with a shuriken, had been hit by a shuriken, though it barely managed to scrape her cheek. It was pure luck that it hadn't been among the poisoned ones. She had easily been able to dodge the brunt of the attack even as distracted as she was with her own opponents. Luck or no, Gaara had made sure that it wasn't necessary to do so again. Before she'd even had the chance to attempt a counterattack, He Sand he controlled with such ease had ripped the small weapon from the air and driven it into the forehead of the man who'd thrown it. After that, there was no other way to describe what had occurred next as anything but a slaughter. She and Kankuro had stood off to the side as Gaara proceeded to thoroughly butcher their opponents, slinging them into walls, impaling them on stalagmites, crushing them to death with his sand. Normally she would stand back and ignore it. It wasn't as if his little tantrums were uncommon, after all, and the best solution was to just get out of the way as fast as possible. What made her think twice was when he'd stepped in. When their team first arrived, he'd simply sat off in the shadows and watched as they fought with their enemies, only bothering to get involved when he'd been attacked directly. It was only after someone targeted her with an attack that successfully managed to scrape through her defenses, even just barely, that he'd become truly engaged in the conflict. Then there was that little out of character, "thank you," earlier the previous morning, which she still couldn't figure out. He'd never thanked anyone, much less for simply delivering the cage's orders. No, she was certain that they were missing something. Kankuro probably noticed it as well, no matter what he might have said on the matter. Of course, they weren't insane enough to bring it up in front of their brother. Perhaps he really had suddenly been afflicted with some unexplainable urge to defend his siblings for once instead of watching impassively as they risked their lives. But they weren't about to tempt his wrath by questioning his actions. As Gaara gave them a curt nod and began walking towards his room, glancing over the small trail of blood running from the cut on her cheek, she knew she was right. Something very unusual was going on with their little brother. Ignoring Kankuro's worried glance, she waited until Gaara had been out of sight for a few minutes before making a decision. Ignoring the slight burning sensation around her wound, she slowly made her way to his room. Her hand was nearly to the door when she hesitated, knowing that Gaara wasn't exactly happy when people failed to announce their presence. She turned the knob and cracked open the door, knocking lightly as she quietly called his name. "Gaara." She pushed it open further, and poked her head into the room. She could see him sitting down, and writing. What would Gaara be writing? Raising her voice a little, she spoke again. "Gaara. It's Tamari." She stepped into the room when he failed to answer and moved a little closer. Then again, considering how small his room was, a little closer was essentially putting her within no more than a few feet of the easily aggravated Jinchuriki. She moved forward until she was just barely at reaching distance, and leaned forward, stretching her hand toward him. She didn't exactly want to touch the younger boy, what with his tendency to slaughter anything that startled or annoyed him, but she couldn't deny that she was worried about her brother's odd behavior. Or maybe she was just worried that this strange attitude would lead to her or Kankuro being hurt, and she wanted to make sure he was still his normal self. And she definitely wanted to figure it out before Kankuro went and blurted out something stupid, as he was often prone to do. She promptly drew her hand away and leapt back as the boy in front of her began to fall apart into a pile of sand, eyes widening when she bumped into something behind her. Something that spoke in a small, yet frighteningly dark voice that both her and her brother had always felt an indescribable urge to hide from. "Did you want something?" She whirled around, cursing herself for the quick movement even as she did so, and trying desperately to stop the hammering in her heart as she realized that Gaara wasn't snapping at the sudden motion. "Gee Gaara, I wanted to see if you were, alright. After the mission, and all," she trailed off before she could finish. As if Gaara was ever anything but healthy after a mission. It was a pathetic excuse, and she knew very well that it wouldn't fool her youngest brother for a second unless he was very, very distracted for some reason. "I'm fine." He reached toward her, and for a moment she thought he was going to make sure that she was as far from fine as she could possibly become. That same simple gesture of raising his hand had ended with more than a few mangled bodies, crushed beneath a coffin of sand. The panic began to set in, at least until his finger glided across her cheek, wiping across the small wound with uncharacteristic gentleness. You should probably clean that. Go to the medical center. Could be poisoned too. She felt herself being lightly pushed from the room, and turned to see the sand that they'd come to fear pulling back from her as she crossed through the threshold. I need some privacy. And with that, the door was closed, and she was left wondering how she'd managed to survive entering what Gaara considered his territory, actually touching him, and having the closest tea into a conversation with him that she'd had with her youngest brother in her entire life. She'd been standing outside his door lost in her thoughts for nearly 10 minutes before she finally dragged herself away and head for the medical center as per Gaara's advice, deciding not to tell Kankuro about the little incident. Knowing him, he'd try to do something stupid to see if he could bond with Gaara and end up ticking him off. With or without his strange new attitude, she wasn't willing to bet that an angry Gaara would be any more pleasant to deal with than before. Gaara, however, continued about his business. He knew very well that she was still outside his door, but the odds of his siblings coming back into his room or office when he wanted to be alone were low even when they'd had a better relationship. Now that he was back at a point in time when they were terrified to even look at him wrong, the odds were practically non-existent. He wrote down a few words on a small piece of paper, and molded his sand to resemble a bird. He definitely wasn't going to trust any of the human messengers in the village, nor would he trust any other form of communication that the cage might be capable of tracking. He'd rarely ever used the sand to move anything a great distance, but the situation called for it. Until the cage's death, he'd never had any reason to send anything. After the cage's death, he had no need to concern himself with others prying into his business, since they either respected him or were too terrified of Shukaku to defy his requests. Besides, with the demon present in his mind again, he would really have little else to do with his nights. Rolling up the note, he placed it in a small opening in the imitation bird and sealed it. Things would probably be better if it didn't look like anything was being delivered at all. Naruto Uzumaki. It seems you've given us another chance. Let's hope we can make use of it. The next day, Konoha. Well, class is almost over, but I have good news. Today, we'll begin working on the basic clone technique. Now, first we'll review the concept behind the jutsu. The clone technique utilizes non-physical copies of those who use it for the sake of distraction and evasion. Iruka formed the ram hand seal. To do this, you begin with the ram, which Naruto's head hit the desk with a thud as he tuned out Iruka's voice. ND cursed whoever had invented the technique. He never had gotten around to learning how to use the standard clones. He'd always figured it was pointless since he could create solid copies that could actually fight instead of just distract. In retrospect, he supposed that he probably should have tried to figure it out when he came back in time, with it being one of the jutsu that his class was expected to know every time the exam came around. What are you so upset for, loser? It's not a hard technique. I've already been able to do it for a year now. You should be able to figure it out eventually. It's okay, Naruto-kun. Most of us are pretty new to this, and you did pretty well on the other stuff Iruka-sensei taught us. Sakura gave him a pat on the shoulder, trying to comfort the blonde as he glared at a smirking Sasuke. And trying to hide her reaction to Sasuke's claim. Which of course matched the thoughts of every other girl nearby that happened to hear what he'd said. Sasuke is so cool. Now, would anyone like to give it a try? At the ensuing silence, Iruka sighed and turned towards their desk. Sasuke. Fine. Why do I always have to do these stupid demonstrations? It's such a waste of time. He made his way to the front of the room, and stood in front of Iruka with a scowl. He lazily went through the signs, clearly bored, and one of the intangible clones appeared to his right and left. Perfect imitations of the original. Naturally, this led to cheering from the girls in the class, and a combination of grumbling, congratulations, and silence from the various boys in the class. Very impressive, Sasuke. You can go back to your seat. Sasuke released the illusions and returned to the desk, clasping his hands in front of him and staring off into space with a bored expression. Easily ignoring the looks he was receiving from almost every girl in class. Wow, Sasuke-kun, Sakura leaned towards him with a blush. That was so cool. Wow, Sasuke-kun, Naruto raised his voice, trying to imitate what he liked to call Sakura's lovey-dovey voice. That was so cool. I know you're a stuck-up, arrogant jackass, but I'd love it if you'd give me a private lesion on. How to? He was cut off as he was pushed from his chair, and gulped as he saw the enraged pink-haired girl glaring at him. Naruto, you little. Excuse me, but is there a problem? Iruka's voice called from the front of the class. Oh, no, Iruka-sensei. Everything's great. And glad as he was that Iruka had spoken up before she'd managed to pummel him into the ground again, the blatantly fake grin that Sakura was forcing made it quite clear that he was going to be in major trouble later. Not that she'd ever actually hurt him even before his little time trip, but frankly, she could be downright terrifying at times. Naruto took a glance over at Sasuke and frowned. And that smug little bastard loves it. If there's no problem, then I think we're done here today. Remember to practice the clone technique tonight. And I'll see you all tomorrow. As Iruka left the room, Naruto felt a sense of impending doom. Oh boy. Hey, Sakura-chan. What's up? Naruto-kun, she said in a voice that was far too sweet. A word, if you please. Alone. I'm not sure if that's. Oh come on, Sakura. Ino walked up beside him, grabbing his arm. He's treating me to lunch. If you're gonna kill him, at least wait until he's paid for it. Oh, okay. But don't take too long. We were meeting at your place, right? Yeah, I'll see you in a little while. Waving goodbye, Ino dragged him from the room in a hurry. Thanks, Ino. I think. So, ramen then. Yes, we can go have ramen. Her grip on his arm tightened, almost cutting off his circulation in the limb. And let's try to avoid making fun of Sasuke-kun in the future, Why yes ma'am. With that, it was suddenly Naruto who was doing the dragging. And with Naruto on the path to ramen, the run barely took any time at all. Within minutes, they were sitting on the stools at the counter of Ichiraku Ramen, with a clearly pleased Kyuki standing behind the counter to greet his favorite customer. Hey, Naruto. And the junior Yamanaka, it's good to see you. How's your mother been lately? Had a little bug last time I saw her. She's been much better lately, Kyuki-san. So, you two gonna have the usual. Sure, maybe usual wasn't the best word to use in Ino's case since she wasn't there that often, but Naruto most definitely had a usual. And that usual was generally expensive enough so that he'd be able to close down for the rest of the day if he felt like it. Especially given that Naruto's portion of said dish was about 3 times bigger than the normal version everyone else usually stuck with. Heck yeah, old man. That sounds fine. Oh come on Ino-chan, you've gotta eat more than that. It's not like the stuff's bad, you know. Kyuki set a few bowls in front of them with a grin, apparently having already expected Naruto to show up. And since he had a tendency to get one of everything, it wasn't too hard to get Ino's prepared. The two ate in relative silence for a few minutes, before Ino decided to continue the conversation. It's not that it's bad. Heck, it's excellent. But it's just got so much sodium and fat that it's not good for my diet. Oh please. You girls make no sense. It's always, diet this, and, diet that. I'm surprised you haven't all starved to death by now. I mean it's. Actually, Kyuki cut into the conversation. I'm working on a recipe that really cuts down on fats and sodium and that kind of thing. Figured it might help broaden my customer range, you know. Both of the blondes seemed to brighten up at this, and Kyuki smiled. He was glad that the kid had made some friends over the years. But most of the few girls he seemed to spend time with were obsessed with their figures, and while it was delicious, he knew most ramen wasn't exactly famous for being the pinnacle of health food. Now, if Naruto had a few more friends like that Choji fellow, Kyuki was pretty sure he and his daughter would be set for life. Uzumaki Naruto and Akamichi Choji, that was a duo that could empty the whole stand in a single sitting. Really? That sounds great. Because I'd really like to have it more oft. Ino glanced over as she noticed the squinty-eyed grin that had appeared on Naruto's face. What's with the freaky look? You love ramen. It's not my favorite, but it's definitely good. You're a rameniac. Oh what now? I've converted another one. Soon the whole world will know the greatness that is ramen. He almost seemed to speak to the bowl in front of him. Soon, my precious little friend, soon. Naruto rubbed his hands together with a semi-maniacal cackle, and the unfad grin that she and Sakura had dubbed his fox grin. And promptly found himself face first in his bowl of ramen, as Ino glared at him. You can be so creepy, Naruto. Ramen is good and all, but you take it to a whole new level. Naruto just grinned at her again, slurping up a stray noodle that had attached itself to his face. You know you guys love me. Hell if I can figure out why. She set her finished bowl down and stood, bowing politely to Chuki. Thank you very much, it was delicious. Smiling, she turned to Naruto. Thanks for the lunch Naruto, but I have to go. Sakura and I were going to go stalk the pretty boy to see if you can catch him alone in a closet somewhere. What? Of course not. Maybe a little. She lightly smacked him in the back of the head with a blush. I was just going to help her arrange some flowers for her mother's birthday. Get your mind out of the gutter, you little pervert. Well, if ya gotta go, then you've gotta go. Later Ino-chan. She gave him a small smile and ruffled his hair playfully. I'll see you tomorrow. Just minutes after she'd left, as Naruto was getting into yet another bowl, he jumped in surprise when a small sandy brown bird landed on the counter. He was far more surprised when the bird burst into sand, revealing a small note amongst the remains, and Chuki looked over at him in curiosity. What's that? Looks like a letter. Chuki grinned, prodded his arm with a spoon. Got yourself a girlfriend, kid. Wah. No, nothing like that. Sorry old man, but I gotta go. Mind if I pay ya back tomorrow? Nah, go on. He shook his head with a laugh as Naruto took off. He didn't know what the letter was about, but it must have been important to the kid for him to take off like he did. Plus, Naruto was his favorite customer. He was always good for his word when it came to money, even if it took him a little while to actually make the payment. After rushing back to his apartment, Naruto unfolded the small note, and began reading it to himself. I remember everything, Uzumaki Naruto. But we should limit our communication. It is good to hear from you again. Gaara. Okay, so maybe he didn't actually write the pauses. But Naruto had known the man for long enough to realize that he'd probably be uncomfortable with the whole expressing himself thing. Unable to hold back a grin, Naruto let out a quick cheer, glad to know that Gaara had apparently remembered their past, or future, or whatever they wanted to call it. Remembering the future. Man, it still feels weird to say that. He folded the letter and placed it in his left pocket, already trying to figure out what he could do now that he wasn't completely alone in this little adventure in the past. Another bowl please. A glare, some slurping, and bowl please. Slurp, bowl, slurp, bowl, bowl, bowl. That's disgusting. Sakura scowled at Naruto and Choji as they raced to put down as much ramen as physically possible in a 5-minute time span. Ino nodded in response, matching the scowl. In the meantime, Kiba was cheering on Choji, while Shino and Shikamaru watched the show silently and Hinata quietly encouraged Naruto. They were all there for more or less the same reason. After all, the first time that Naruto and Choji had decided to have one of these little competitions, the older man running the ramen stand and his daughter had been frantic trying to keep up the supply of ramen for the ravenous duo. As a result, they had stated in no uncertain terms that they wanted a little warning the next time the two black holes decided to compete in their shop. But more importantly, Kiba had noticed the spectacle as he passed by, and in a display of cleverness that was rather unusual for him, had subtly started making bets over which of the two would win. Naturally, he felt compelled to bring the rest of the class into the game. Ino and Sakura personally had no interest in watching the duo gorging, but Sasuke was there to make some extra money while his schedule was empty, and if they were going to be following him they figured that they might as well place a bet or two and try to do the same. Shino simply seemed curious as to what his classmates did with their free moments, as he rarely spent time with them outside of the academy, and Shikamaru figured it was an easy way to get paid without having to actually put any effort into it. Being a genius probably didn't hurt his odds. As for Hinata, she had yet to even place a bet, instead arriving for the sake of spending time with her crush and because it was easier to feel like she was part of the group in these little outings, as compared to when they were in the classroom. And so there they sat once again, staring at the display with a sort of morbid fascination as E2 bottomless pits guzzled and slurped, gulped and burped, then asked for another round. As the two simultaneously reached for another bowl, a dark-haired man dashed into the stand, nearly toppling over Kiba in the process. Am I late? Is it over already? Kiba smirked at him, holding out a hand. Nope. Just 2 minutes in. You betting the usual? Heck yeah. Shisui Uchiha dropped a few coins into the younger boy's hand, and began cheering Choji on alongside the Inuzuka that he had unofficially dubbed as his gambling rival. Shisui's appearance was more due to a combination of loving Tyuki's cooking and enjoying the sport, than actually wanting to make any money. After all, Jonin were paid pretty well and he was one of the most skilled members of one of the most prestigious clans in Konoha, the world even, so it wasn't as though he were poor. Besides, Makoto had practically ordered him to keep an eye on Sasuke when he was spending any amount of time with the demon boy, as quite AF. EU of the villagers seemed intent on calling him. Though honestly, he had the feeling that Makoto held more resentment towards Naruto for being involved in Itachi's departure than just because of his connection to the Kyuubi. Or, if he felt like being a little more objective, she was unnerved by his involvement. They'd had their fair share of arguments on the matter, and it was easy to see that He found it frightening to think that the Kyuubi might be able to influence or control its Jinchuriki. An understandable concern really, considering the seemingly random nature of the outburst. But there was something he couldn't quite pinpoint about her actions, something she was hiding from him about her feelings on the excitable vessel of the Kyuubi. But now wasn't the time for that. Now was the time for the sport of gods. Ramen off. 3 minutes later, and Naruto dropped backwards off of the stool, while Choji's head hit the bar, both letting out a groan in the process. Ayame, who had been fighting to keep count of the number of bowls that they'd gone through, grinned and raised one of Naruto's arms into the air, albeit with some effort, given that he didn't really want to get up off of the ground. Gesturing in a clearly overdramatic way. We have a winner. The challenger has taken the title from our defending champion, with 38 bowls to 36. Let's hear it for Naruto Uzumaki. And with that, she promptly joined her father in plopping down in the nearest chair for a break. Hosting these little competitions wasn't exactly what one would call an S-rank mission. But anyone who knew Naruto and Choji realized that trying to keep up with their orders in an eating contest may as well have been a one-on-one duel with the Hokage while your hands were tied behind your back. The entire booth, save for Kiba, the cooks, and the competitors, let out a disappointed moan. Choji almost never failed to eat more than Naruto. The idea that someone outside of the Akamichi clan could actually out-eat the seemingly endless pit that was Choji's stomach was unthinkable. And so, with a few grumbles, the onlookers paid their debts to the one person that had actually bet on Naruto, Kiba Inuzuka. As soon as the gamblers and a very cheery, if somewhat bloated, Naruto had left, Choji sat up and turned to the Kiba as he held out a small pouch. Here you go. Told you we'd make a killing if you took a dive. And I've gotta treat you to that barbecue. A deal's a deal. Actually, I'm pretty full. I could have eaten more, but Uzumaki can really put that stuff down. Kiba's incredulous expression at the admission was, at least in Choji's opinion, priceless. Seriously. Yeah, I think I'm losing my touch. I'll need to train a bit more. Right. Akamaru, ever present atop his owner's head, yipped in agreement. Only Choji would actually train himself to eat more. Then again, from what his mother had told him about the Akamichi fighting style, it made a bit of sense, strange as it may have seemed. Well, I'll treat you to some barbecue anyway. That was a good show. Really. Awesome. Later Tyuki-san, Ayame-san. The two waved at the boys with cheery expressions. Sure, they'd overheard the entire exchange. But they didn't intend to say a word to the others about the little scam. Kids would be kids, and ninja would be ninja. Besides, it just wouldn't do for the contests to stop. They'd known Naruto for years. And now that he finally had a group of friends that would spend that kind of time with him while he did something he enjoyed, they definitely didn't want to interfere. The poor kid needed all the friends he could get. Not far away, as a certain Inuzuka was preparing to lose a good portion of his earnings, Naruto was sitting cross-legged on the bed in his apartment. Sweat trickling across the back of his neck. And he couldn't help but grin in triumph. He allowed the spinning ball of chakra to fade away, dismissed his shadow clone, and wiped his forehead on high. sleeve while the orange markings around his eyes disappeared, more than a little pleased with his success. He'd long since mastered the ability to use the standard version of the Rasengan with one hand. And had even managed the same with the wind release, Rasengan, but he still couldn't form the far more powerful Rasenshuriken without several of his clones. His rather limiting circumstances didn't help much, as he didn't exactly have many opportunities to practice the Rasengan or any of its variants, and he definitely wasn't going to try tampering with something like the Rasenshuriken while in a small apartment. Hell, he'd be hesitant to practice it in anything short of a desert considering how much damage it could cause if it was successful, never mind the chaos it would cause if something actually went wrong. Though the shinobi of the village had been somewhat unnerved by the knowledge that he knew of the Kyuubi, a fact that had been kept from the general populace, he no longer had to completely restrict himself. As long as they knew that he could contact the fox, he could play many of his improvements off as things that he'd picked up from the dark presence or that it had expo aimed after having seen them in action itself. So him figuring out basic things such as tree walking didn't bother his soon-to-be fellow shinobi in the least. And whenever a villager noticed and complained, the Hokage simply told them that he was aware of the situation and that everything was under control. And with Naruto under seemingly constant surveillance from shinobi positioned around the village and his academy teachers, how could they deny that the Hokage most likely did have everything taken care of? The problem was when it came to techniques like the Rasengan. There were probably less than 5 people alive who knew the move well enough to actually use it, and he doubted the "I learned it from Fuzzy-chan" excuse would work on that one. It was one thing to figure out how to focus chakra into your feet, or how to move your wrist to better direct a shuriken. It was a completely different matter to master a complex and high-ranking technique only mastered by several Hokage-level shinobi. As a result, he'd been more or less limited to training it in the privacy of his room which, while allowing him to form and reform the chakra repeatedly, still didn't allow him to actually test what it could do. Then again, it was probably a good thing. If he wasn't limited, he would probably end up trying to use the Rasenshuriken, and odds are that he wouldn't be at it long before he was in the hospital again, what with the technique's tendency to ruin his arm for a while after he used it. And so, he worked to remedy one of the most notable drawbacks of his new form. He was far from mastering Sage Mode. But he was getting better. In fact, thinking back on it, the reason he'd probably been killed in the first place was because he'd quit his training early. Despite Fukusaku's warnings, he hadn't been able to stand by when he'd learned that Konohagakure was under attack and had rushed off to help. Unfortunately, this pain had nearly decimated the village before learning of Naruto's location, and had left just moments before he had returned. Though from the state of the village, his incomplete Sage Mode might not have made much of a difference. After slaughtering most of the things at Mount Myoboku, the Akatsuki leader had returned to his headquarters for a short time to recover. Then not a month later he'd returned in full force before he'd had the time to continue working on his sage powers. And when he said full force, he meant full force. Having captured the Hachibi during the time between invasions, the Akatsuki was determined to finish their mission. Even with aid from Tsunagakure and their unexpected temporary alliance with Orochimaru, or Kabuto, or whatever the hell he was calling himself at the time, they'd been unable to fend off the full might of the Akatsuki. What was even more confusing was that, while Madara and the Six Paths had clearly been intent on capturing him, Itachi's former partner had been the one to tear him in half from behind with that massive sword of his. And they hadn't seen the plant-like member after he'd stabbed the recently arrived Sasuke just as the battle was beginning. Or at least, he'd seen nothing more of them. Perha. P.S. Gaara would be able to shed more light on that missing piece of information. But now, he had the time. He couldn't learn under Fukusaku's tutelage of course, but there were a variety of improvements he could make by himself. For one, mastering the Rasengan was considerably less stressful when he limited the use of his own chakra in favor of the natural energy of the sage arts. He'd also quickly realized that he started to lose control of said energy when he attempted to move, which had led to his current training method. Shadow clones. Somehow or another, when all else failed, his most successful training techniques always seemed to come down to shadow clones. In this case, it had been strangely simple once he'd taken the time to consider the problem. He couldn't gather and use the energy on his own while he was moving. So the most reasonable solution was for someone else, like a clone, to gather it for him. Once he'd successfully managed that, the rest had been relatively simple. He'd concocted a few ideas. But for now his favorite was the decision to transform one of his sage clones into a scroll to carry around with him while it gathered energy. He even had a few ideas on how to improve the Rasenshuriken. If he could ever actually get away from the village long enough to try them out. He had no doubt that things would start getting easier once he'd become a shinobi and met Jiraiya. It'd definitely give him the opportunity to advance, without needing so many excuses and precautions in place. But for now, he could only work with what he had, and what he had was enough. Privacy to learn jutsu and work on his chakra control. So with that thought, he left to find Shisui. The man was just about the only Uchiha besides Sasuke that could actually stand him, and he was Fu. LLY intent on taking advantage of this fact so that he'd have an excuse to train with someone. Sunagaku. After living in the same village as the redhead for roughly a decade, the residents of Sunaga. Kerr had certainly learned at least two things. The first was that Gaara had no good side to speak of. The closest thing he had to a good side was more realistically described as a moderately less homicidal side. And the only way to stay on this particular side of him was to make sure you didn't do anything to set him off, and to remain as far from whatever happened to attract his ire at the time as you possibly could. The easiest way to do this was avoid any and all contact whatsoever, given that an action might please him one day, and then that exact same action might send him into a bloody rage the next. The second thing that most had learned was that Gaara of the Sand did not make requests. He didn't make threats. He didn't make suggestions, demands, or promises. What Gaara of the Sand made were statements. If he wanted into a room, he did not ask that someone move out of his way. He did not warn them to stay out of his way, and he did not order someone to move out of his way. He simply stated that they would move out of his way, or if he didn't feel like addressing them as individuals, that he would be entering the room. If they happened to disagree with whatever his statement might have been, then there weren't many who were willing to interfere with the events that would follow soon afterwards. It was everyone for his or herself, in that scenario. So when Gaara entered the Cage's office, and stated that he would be joining him on his trip to Konohagakure for the meeting regarding the schedule for the upcoming Chunin exams at the end of the year, which were to take place in Sunagaku. Everyone involved knew that he was going to be joining them in Konoha. Despite his power, for one didn't become a Kage without the appropriate skill and strength that was needed for the position. All of the 4th Cage's assassins had failed to destroy Sunagaku's greatest weapon, and he was unwilling to risk his own death in an attempt to destroy the boy. At least, he refused to do so when Gaara's intentions clearly weren't a threat to the village or its occupants at the time. Glancing up at the Jinchuriki, he leaned back into his chair, resting his arms on the desk in front of him. He had no intention of showing fear in front of the child, regardless of what they all knew he was capable of. That was an admission of weakness that the Cage would be perfect. TLY willing to take with him to the grave. And why are you so eager to leave the village all of a sudden, Curiosity. Well, that had been somewhat unexpected. Gaara normally responded to him with nothing but a glare, which he generally returned with a sarcastic or biting remark before agreeing with whatever it was that Gaara had said. The boy had seemed a little odd recently. He might just avenue to look a little more closely into that. Very well. But do try to keep yourself under control. I'd hate to deal with the kind of paperwork that would pile up if you threw one of your tantrums in another village. Gaara's only response was a grunt as he spun around and moved to return to his business. For the last month, he and Naruto had attempted to remain in some limited form of contact, but it was getting problematic. Communicating through letters could always be a risky venture, especially between villages that weren't exactly on the greatest terms, and the Cage would certainly know. If his precious weapon suddenly started receiving and sending them out of nowhere. And while Gaara could probably kill any messenger that intercepted one of his letters and attempted to pass the knowledge onto the Cage with minimal effort, he would rather avoid the relentless bloodbaths that had once made him a legend in a number of villages. He was trying to change that particular image. And going around butchering people wouldn't exactly speed the process up. No, it was time for him and his fellow Jinchuriki to reunite in person. So, these are your children then, Cage Dono. The third Hokage looked over the trio standing behind Sunagaku's leader curiously. He'd never actually seen the Kage's family before, though he'd heard stories that the youngest of them could be quite vicious when he wanted to be. And admittedly, he did look a bit unfriendly as compared to the others, but certainly not like a monster. The Kage nodded in turn, pointing to each of the three. Indeed, this is Temari, Kankuro. And, he paused at the redhead for a moment, contemplating just how he wanted to introduce him, Gaara, of the desert. Well, it's a pleasure to meet all of you. Gaara gave his own half-hearted nod while his siblings bowed deeply. It wasn't that he lacked respect for the Hokage, but he'd never been especially fond of the formalities of the position, especially why when he'd had almost no association with the other Kages whatsoever until he'd been thrust into the position himself. Either way, the elderly man didn't seem to take any kind of offense at his gesture. If anything, he seemed pleased. Strange. It was much like Naruto. He began to ponder if perhaps the Hokage was at least partially responsible for the blonde Jinchuriki's positive attitude. So, the old man spoke again. Would you like to attend our meeting? It would be a good experience if you intend to get involved in the political workings of our nations. If not, then please feel free to roam the village. That is if you have no objection, of course, Kage Dono. Their father looked them over for a moment, before coming to a decision. Since Gaara seemed uninterested in the offer, he had no reason to bring him along. But he certainly couldn't let the boy wander around a foreign village by himself. That could lead to far too many possible disasters to even consider. Temari already had an acceptable understanding of these matters, which left. Kankuro, you'll be coming with us. Temari, Gaara, you're free to do as you wish. In other words, Temari, make sure that your brother does. Inti try to murder half of our allies while we're in the meeting. Even if he would still probably kill them without hesitation, Kankuro and Temari were just about the only people whom the Kage Knew that Gaara wouldn't kill simply for breathing when he was in a bad mood. And of the two, Temari was the more level-headed one, and far less likely to say or do something to incur her brother's wrath. Besides, Kankuro could use the lessons. He always seemed to disappear whenever they tried to teach him about politics, and this was a situation that he couldn't just talk his way out of. Half an hour later, and in a different part of the village, there was another confrontation occurring. The previous was a polite political meeting between two Kages. This one, however, I'm giving you one more chance, loser. Oh please. Like I'm really scared of you, bastard. Of course not. I wouldn't expect an idiot to be scared of playing with fire, no matter how many times he's been burned. Now I'm telling you to drop it. Or what? Think you can catch me? Naruto knelt down on the side of the wall out of Sasuke's reach, holding out the bright red tomato that he'd snapped from the dark-haired boy's hands mere moments after he'd bought it. Much to Sasuke's annoyance, his parents hadn't quite gotten around to teaching him the nifty little trick that would allow him to walk on walls, water, or such surfaces that one normally couldn't. The idiot, on the other hand, apparently had picked it up somewhere. And now he had his tomato. Unforgivable. This would not end well. What's wrong, Sasuke? Too slow, and with that cry, Naruto was lifted into the air by what appeared to be a string of sand wrapped around his ankle. Sasuke blinked in confusion, and glanced towards the sky for a moment. Before shrugging and picking up the tomato his antagonist had dropped in his ascent. HMPH. Anticlimactic, but convenient. At least I don't have to chase him around again. As he took a moment to be the thin layer of dust covering the treat off on his shirt, a blonde girl around his age, maybe a little older, walked up behind him with a concerned look. Tapping his shoulder to get his attention, she pointed to the place where Naruto had just been. Hey, aren't you worried about your friend? Should I be worried? Perhaps, but to be completely honest, it's not that unusual. Not for the idiot, anyway. Not really, no. I've seen him do stranger things. The girl looked as though she wanted to say something, but after a few seconds of deliberation, apparently came to the conclusion that it wasn't worth it. So with an apprehensive glance towards the rooftops, Temari walked off and prayed that nothing would go wrong. Her brother had just disappeared on her minutes earlier, and while he had Inti seemed particularly homicidal recently, she had no idea what he'd want with the loud kid that had been annoying the cute one. Either way, Since they weren't currently being showered in blood, she could only hope that the Jinchuriki just found the kid interesting and felt curious. As Naruto shot through the air, only to come to a sudden stop moments later and considerably higher off the ground, he was less than pleased. He didn't like being hauled into the air without any kind of warning beforehand, he didn't like hanging upside down, and sure as hell didn't like being interrupted when he was taunting his eventual teammate and greatest rival. So when he stopped spinning and finally got his bearings straight, he prepared the harshest glare he could muster, which admittedly wasn't all that intimidating. And prepared to chew someone out like never before. Okay, what the heck is hey Gaara. Mind letting me go? Naruto grinned at the one-time cage, his frustration dissipating in an instant at the sight of his old ally. With a casual wave, the red-headed Jinchuriki released his grip on his ankle, allowing him to drop to the rooftop as the sand returned to its home in the G. That never seemed to leave Gaara's back. It's been some time, Naruto Uzumaki. Yeah, especially with, he gestured at himself, this whole thing. It is a rather strange feeling. Naruto let out one of those cheeky chuckles, reaching back to scratch behind his head in an all-too-familiar gesture. In the end, Gaara couldn't remember seeing him so careless. Not since the Toad Sannin fell. Tell me about it. I think I was in shock at first, then for a while there I thought I might be going crazy. So it seems we were both confused. At least he wasn't alone in that feeling. How did you know you weren't? Well, I didn't exactly remember much from my childhood real well. Just the big stuff, When that stuff started happening the way I thought it would, I just kinda figured it must have been real. Yep, or one heck of a dream. Till I heard from you, I wasn't sure if I got sent back in time, or just had some kind of vision of the future or something like that, or if I really just went nuts. It must have been difficult. Not that bad. Haven't been able to do a lot. Stopped the Uchiha from getting killed off, but I haven't had a chance to do much else. Can't even leave the village yet without most of the people here freaking out. Just leave changing things to me for now. There was only so much he'd be able to do given his own circumstances, but at least he was capable of leaving the village whenever he chose to do so. Hey, you just wanna have all the fun to yourself. Soon as I'm out of the academy, I'm gonna start kicking some ass. I'm sure. So, what's the plan? Is there a plan? Naruto plopped down on the roof, crossing his legs and resting his chin on his palm. We've got to come up with something, Gaara shrugged, joining the blonde on the ground. All I have now are goals, but no path. The Akatsuki, Orochimaru. I don't think we could bring down the freak with the mask or pain right now, so they're off limits until we've gotten a bit stronger. I agree. Let's see, we've definitely gotta take out Orochimaru as soon as possible. Snake bastard just doesn't give up, and we can't afford to let him take Sasuke. Frankly, it wouldn't do him or Sakura any good emotionally, especially now that he knew it was going to happen, and with the kind of potential Sasuke had it wouldn't exactly be healthy for the village either. If we intend to destroy Orochimaru, our best opportunity would probably be the Chunin exams. He'll expect us all to trust the cage, and he'll expect the cage to trust him. The Chunin exams, if things don't change too much by then, we can probably deal with a lot of our problems there. I mean, the Akatsuki's out, but some of the best that Orochimaru's got will be there. Indeed, and what of Sasuke Uchiha's elder brother? The one that drove him to Orochimaru? Itachi. I'm not sure. As long as he doesn't kill off his clan or get the Mangekyo Sharingan, we can probably leave him alone for a while. We'll still need to deal with him sooner or later though. From what I've seen, he's pretty dangerous, even just with the regular Sharingan. It seems we have our work cut out for us, then. Nah, you and me can handle it no problem. We're the ones with the surprise this time. Somehow, Gaara couldn't help the small smile that appeared with that statement. Still so very optimistic. It's inspiring. You have that effect on people. He really did. There was just something about the personality of the Kyuubi's host that seemed to draw people to him. It's no big deal. I disagree. Naruto's head tilted to the side in confusion. What do you mean? I'm not sure that you understand just how much of an effect you have on people. Me, for instance. Really? Yes, really. Before our battle, I was a monster. Don't try to deny it. He silenced Naruto before he could make the protest that he was obviously intent on making. I was alone. I had family, but we were only family through blood. My only purpose, for them or myself, was to kill anything that needed to be killed. And more often than not, things that didn't need to be killed. This time, he could avoid that. You, Naruto Uzumaki, changed that. The blonde just shook his head in response. I didn't make you care about them, Gaara. That was all you. Perhaps you didn't force me to care about people, no. But I never had and never would have even considered the possibility of doing so until after meeting you. The strength you had when you fought to protect people who were precious to you, it changed me, somehow. I wanted to have something to care about, something that I would go to the same lengths you did to protect, that I could draw that strength from, and perhaps, something that cared enough for me to do the same. I wanted a family. A real one. Gaara, you didn't create my bonds. But you gave me both the reason and the means to build them. Well, glad I could help, Gaara. They sat in silence again, looking out over the quiet village, Gaara watching as his first friend shuffled awkwardly. He understood, he'd been the same way when people actually began praising him instead of shunning him. But it just seemed so wrong coming from the young blonde. It was wrong that any child would be treated as they had, but someone like him, someone who never once gave in and justified our hatred of him, somehow it just felt so much worse. Konohagakure is a pleasant place. Perhaps the people left something to be desired at times, but the village itself was quite a pleasant sight. Yeah, it is. Not much like Suna though, I mean, no offense Gaara, but I'm not really a fan of the desert. Naruto glanced over and gave the redhead a grin. Suna is beautiful in its own way, I suppose. Ya think? His features shifted into a more quizzical expression, his thoughts drifting towards Sunagakure's appearance. The desert is dangerous, deadly. Just to live can be a struggle. And to see my people not only survive, but thrive, I find it beautiful. You know, that kinda makes sense. I've never really thought about it like that. So why do you like Konoha so much? Admittedly, and if he didn't like how Suna looked in comparison to Konoha, Naruto had to respect anyone that could live there. He'd probably go crazy if he tried to live in such a dry, barren place for any extended period of time. Konohagakure is different. It's calming, soothing. Here, I feel peace. A barely audible sigh passed his lips, and he lifted his head to look over the village, the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth an obvious sign of content to anyone who truly knew him. Yes, peace. Peace, Yeah, that's a pretty good way to describe it. And when do you get so darn poetic, Gaara? What's that supposed to mean? Well, it's just that from what little I've heard, you do your best to make sure that things around here are as far from peaceful as possible. Oh come on, I'm not much of a prankster anymore. And they weren't that bad. Gaara just gave him a pointed, skeptical look. What? I'm serious. Hey, don't give me that look. Okay, so maybe I still do a prank now and then. What's the big deal? You just don't give up, do ya? Alright, I'll admit it. I still do a prank or two every couple months. Weeks. Days. Translation. That was a claim that he could actually believe. Yeesh. Ever consider being an interrogator? You're rather simple to read, Naruto Uzumaki. Naruto stuck his tongue out. Gaara just smirked. Temari had known that her youngest brother was traveling across the rooftops. She hadn't tried to stop him, of course, because that would be among the most idiotic and insane decisions that she could have possibly made in her entire life. Besides, aside from the fact that trying to stop Gaara from doing something that he wanted to do was an incredibly dangerous choice, he didn't seem interested in causing damage. And so it made no sense to do something that might rid him of the very pleasant mood he'd been in lately, or as pleasant a mood as a lunatic who proved his existence through the torture and brutal murder of others could be in. So she'd been reasonably concerned when, out of the blue, he'd snatched a young blonde boy off of the ground and dragged him through the air to his location. On one hand, she didn't want the poor kid to get killed. It's not like the people of this village were used to avoiding Gaara's wrath, and while she wasn't the kindest and most courteous person in history, It wasn't as though she was completely heartless. Besides, even if she didn't care as a person, it would be especially problematic for the sand if said death was at Gaara's hands. But when the blonde boy's companion had said that he'd seen him, to stranger, she figured that they might be able to get out of the village before anything could be connected to them to any incidents that might occur. Nothing could have prepared her for what she saw an hour later, when she decided to get something to eat. Her little brother. At some random little run-down shop in the streets of the village. Laughing. Okay. So perhaps it wasn't a loud, echoing, bellow of a laugh or anything like that. It was more of a muffled chuckle. Not even a full chuckle, really, but considering the fact that this was Gaara of the Sand. The small sound was above and beyond what anyone could ever expect to see. And it wasn't the insane, twisted, guttural version of a laugh that he tended to growl out when he was killing someone. It was a genuinely happy, pleasant laugh. This, she decided, was proof that Gaara's shift in moods lately hadn't all been in her head. Or maybe he's finally snapped. He prospect wasn't exactly a pleasant train of thought, and so she shoved it into the back of her thoughts. If her little brother had finally gone completely out of his mind, it seemed to be more of an improvement than anything. Besides, she was curious, especially given that the person he was there with was the same kid that she was convinced would be a bloody mess before the day was over. So with some hesitation, and more anxiety that she would ever care to admit, she walked over to see exactly what the two were so amused with. Gaara. The duo turned to look at her, and Gaara's face shifted into more controlled expression. Though it was still a far softer than she could ever remember seeing on him. The blonde boy glanced back and forth between them a few times, before pointing at her. So that's your sister, right? Temari. Right, Temari. As if he didn't already know. Still, playing the part could be fun sometimes. He'd certainly managed to annoy his teachers and classmates by accurately guessing what they would say and how they would react in certain situations. It wasn't perfect, but it was usually close enough. Hey, wanna join us? Sure, I guess. I mean if it's okay with you, Gaara. At the slight nod, she took a seat next to her brother, glancing at him from the corner of her eye as she tried to focus on what she wanted to order. The whole thing was a little surreal. And Gaara's attitude was just plain starting to freak her out. She couldn't say whether or not he'd confirmed it with the blonde boy earlier, but he had actually just referred to her as his sister rather than a potential target, albeit indirectly. What's been wrong with him lately? As she gave her order to the old man whom she presumed was the owner of the stand, she couldn't help taking a moment to ponder that thought. She had to admit that their family really must be pretty screwed up if the first idea to cross her mind when her brother actually treated her as a person instead of a tool was that there must be something wrong with him. Yet just as she'd felt so many times since he'd started acting so strange, after getting through all of the anxiety it was somehow pleasing see the little boy acting so much more human. So, Tanuki boy here says that you guys are visiting on business. What's the deal? Tanuki boy. Yeah, you know. Naruto hopped out of his seat and walked behind Gaara. Turning him to face Temari as the redhead, well, he pretty much held the same blank look as always, almost as if he was unaware of the contact at all. If that had been her, they'd be finding the remains for months. Reaching around Gaara's head to point at the dark circles around his eyes and poking at them, as if his own sister wouldn't already be clearly aware of their presence, Naruto continued. See, just like a little Tanuki. That's, what exactly was one supposed to say to the person who cheerily poked fun at a sadistic murderer about his appearance? Especially, ally when that person was basically asking you to do the same, and when you would have to live with said murderer. Accurate. Accurate. Well, I guess. I was kind of expecting things like, cuddly, or, oh that's so cute. I wanna hug him, or something. You know, all that girly girl type of stuff. But I guess you're not really a girly type of person. She felt herself twitch. Are you saying I'm not feminine? Okay. So she didn't go out of her way to act like a lot of the girls her age. But kunoichi or not, she was quickly on her way to becoming a woman, at least as far as she was concerned. Though Kankuro insisted she was still an annoying little girl, and she didn't want to come off as overtly masculine. Maybe she didn't want to be mistaken for one of the shallow brats who went around blubbering about their looks day in and day out, but it couldn't be a good sign if a boy just a couple years younger than her thought she was too boyish. And no, nothing like that. I'm just saying, gee, that you're a lot more boyish than most of the girls I know. Another twitch, and Naruto had the distinct feeling that if he didn't clear things up very quickly, there was going to be much pain wrought upon his 10-year-old self. Tamari and Gaara's thought processes were running along very similar pathways. But it's not that it's just I mean, the girls I know are really, really girly, so. It seemed to be getting worse. Much worse. It was nearly as bad as the time Sakura had found him just as he was showing off one of his new sexy jutsu to Konohamaru, whom she had apparently deemed a way too young for that kind of thing. His head hadn't stopped spinning for weeks after that one. Thankfully, he had Gaara to back him up this time. A little help here, maybe. Gaara, well, it was difficult for someone who was doing absolutely nothing to pause, but somehow he managed to pull it off. After several seconds of contemplation, he offered his solution. Stop. Shut up. Sit down. Eat your ramen. Okay. So he kind of had Gaara on his side. From a certain point of view. If you looked close enough. Even if the Sand Jinchuriki wasn't exactly polite in his rescue attempt. Of course, Naruto couldn't just do as he was told. That would be far too easy. Instead he decided that a new course of action would be more amusing and less likely to end with his voice raising a few pitches after. A blow to a particularly sensitive section of his anatomy. Ah, come on little Tanuki boy, I'm just having a lit wah. Naruto fell backwards, landing hard on his hindquarters. Letting out an annoyed mumble that sounded eerily similar to stupid sand powers, which Tamari was too distracted to notice as she saw small tendrils of sand settling back to the ground from where they'd silently shifted under the blonde's feet. He pulled himself back onto his seat and sent a mock glare towards the other boy. In the meantime, Tamari was staring at the scene aghast, half expecting Gaara to suddenly go mad and destroy the entire city block. And half awed that he'd been so remarkably patient with a complete stranger when he'd carelessly threatened even his own family on numerous occasions. Not to mention that he'd once again broken his normal routine and come to her defense, albeit in a different manner, and despite the fact that it was at least partially for the other boy's sake, rather than hers. It just didn't make sense. She was, much unlike Kankuro, driven by logic. She organized. She strategized. She planned. She prepared. There was rhyme and reason to everything, and everything had its place and purpose. She wasn't obsessive when it came to having order, but she couldn't just overlook how severely Gaara was breaking the natural workings of their lives. And what's more, he was doing so without any apparent reason aside from the fact that he simply felt like it. Even as random as his actions normally seemed to those who didn't know him, she'd watched him often enough to realize that unnoticeable as they might appear. He did have a tentative sort of system to his madness. In the end, she decided that it would probably just be better for her sanity if she took his advice to the annoying orange-clad boy herself. Stop, shut up, sit down, and eat the ramen. However, even if she did stop trying to analyze the red-haired boy, she couldn't bring herself to stop observing him. Nor could she seem to take her eyes off the boy currently chatting away about any and all pointless little matters that crossed his mind. He was loud and annoying. Gaara didn't like loud and annoying people. He killed loud and annoying people. There must have been something special about this one. But what? He was cute in an odd way, yes, but Gaara had never cared about things like that. Looking from a different angle, he did bear some similarities to their uncle, but for some reason Gaara had closed off after their father had told them of Yashimaru's death. Still, even if he did resemble Yashimaru, it was only slight. And many people in their own village had those same features. No, it was something else. As she watched the boy practically breathe in the soupy dish, she decided that Gaara was treating him with such unusual kindness because he was, to put it quite bluntly, weird. With that conclusion in mind, she turned to her meal, intent on trying not to mentally dissect the duo to figure out what made them tick. Or perhaps in Gaara's case, what was making him tick so out of order recently. No, bad. Stop analyzing. So she did. And when she stopped trying to do so, she found herself actually enjoying the odd little activity with her brother and his mildly insane friend. Yes, friend. Gaara had a friend. It was almost inconceivable, but she couldn't deny what she was seeing with her own two eyes. In a short time she found she was beginning to enjoy the blond boy's ramblings, which seemed to flood from his mouth without hesitation, and consisted of everything from jokes to complaints about people who didn't understand the glory of ramen, details of his oh-so-brilliant exploits also known to a select few as pranks, though Naruto seemed shocked and appalled that she would then consider his amazing art to be mere gags. The only problem was, it was bound to end sooner or later. And that time came when the messenger bird that was constantly waiting with the cage's bodyguards in case of an emergency, or if he simply needed to drag his agents away from whatever they were doing, fluttered into the small shop. Whether or not it came as a comfort that Gaara didn't show signs of any uncharacteristic behavior as they bade the strange child farewell, she wasn't certain. Neither boy seemed to be upset or surprised with the seemingly harsh departure, of course, considering that Gaara had never actually been in such a situation. She supposed she couldn't really say if it was a harsh separation or the nicest thing that Gaara would ever do for someone. Letting the matter drop, she simply smiled and waved goodbye, walking a short ways ahead of her brother. Despite their lack of rush, it wasn't very long before they were able to spot the cage, his guards, and Kankuro at the gates to the village. And considering that the cage began to move towards said gates, she came to the conclusion, with no real surprise, that he simply didn't care what they had been doing. Only that Gaara had behaved himself. On the other hand, how was it? Are you freaking kidding me, Tamari? It was crap. You guys are so lucky, getting to run around the village like that. I had sit around and listen to a bunch of old geezers yap on about the old days for hours, and then I had to sit through an even longer session of, we'll be having this many of that for those guys in that thing, crap before I was free. Shut up, Kankuro. He twisted around to look at her, holding his hand up and mimicking a mouth. Shut up, Kankuro. Easily one of the most intentionally horrible imitations of her voice that she'd ever heard, but after the day she'd had she couldn't bring herself to do much more than chuckle and stick her tongue out at him. He returned the gesture. That gesture was promptly rewarded with a ball of sand striking him in the face, sending the young puppet practitioner into a fit of sputtering and coughing. Tamari jerked back in surprise, turning just in time for her youngest brother to pass by her face impassive as it always was. When he was in front of their little group, he allowed himself a quick smirk before forcing the neutral expression back into place. Sometimes, it was fun to be the immature one. The young man, or perhaps child in the eyes of many who failed to genuinely grasp what a shinobi's life was, grunted as the blade was driven through his hands, pinning him to the pillar he'd nearly shattered upon being thrown against it. To see one of the Sannin in such a miserable state, what a pathetic display. Orochimaru released his grip on the kusanagi, instead leaning his palms one over the other on the end of the hilt and chuckling at the taunt. Regardless of the danger it may have posed, he didn't bother to avoid the Uchiha's gaze, and lowered his head to examine the unique appearance of the Sharingan with curiosity. Much as he'd expected, Itachi didn't show the slightest sign of anger or fear, staring back at his opponent with bored and dismissive eyes. Truly, he was a model representation of what those in their world aimed to become. Relentless, fearless, untouchable, and with more than what was necessary to back up those feet. Yours if intimidation wasn't enough, a perfect host. Are you certain you don't want to take that back, my little Uchiha? You aren't in much of a position to be making insults. The rest of the Akatsuki's little minions aren't about to come running to your aid, after all. For now we're all alone. It's just you and me. I suppose you expected me to be surprised at this betrayal. Of course I didn't. Everyone knew this was coming. I doubt there's a single person in the Akatsuki who doesn't have a plan of their own. We've all merely united until our mutual enemies are no longer quite so threatening. My time just came a little earlier than everyone else's. I may be the first, but I certainly won't be the last. I see. So you do have at least some understanding of the reality behind the organization. It's true that we are all working to our own ends. However, you're wrong in one regard. He pressed upward on the hilt, letting loose another chuckle when the young boy's eyes narrowed slightly in frustration, though without any true signs of pain. And what might that be? Your betrayal wasn't the first. And the snake-like eyes widened as a familiar voice spoke quietly from behind him. Long time no see, Orochimaru. Quote, Naruto stepped into the small apartment, just like countless others provided to orphans who lived on their own or those who couldn't afford anything else, with a sigh. Meeting with Gaara had been fun, and he'd never been quite as relieved as he'd been when he finally confirmed that he truly wasn't alone in this little venture. Especially considering that unlike himself, Gaara did have the means of affecting things beyond simply training and hoping that events would fall into place the way that he wanted them to. He flipped on the light and made his way to the small kitchen area. The thought of more ramen already making him practically drool. So, what should it be tonight? Miso. Or maybe Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi no Yoko. Naruto whirled around as he heard the words, hand flicking towards where his weapon pouch had always adorned his leg and only just barely managing to stop the action mid-motion. The arrival's expression never changed, but Naruto would expect no less. The man calmly sitting at the small table, which was unsurprisingly still covered in the leftovers of his breakfast, was notoriously skilled at keeping his emotions in check. But why had he shown up here? Of all places. Regardless, he was certain that the action had triggered some surprise. Or considering who he was dealing with, suspicion. Huh, who are you, old man? You know, people always tell me not to talk to strangers. Actually, he'd never once been told not to talk to strangers by anyone, but that wasn't really the point. No, the point would be to cause as much trouble for the dark-haired shinobi as possible. I'm an associate of the third Hokage. Yeah, and still no reaction, not that it was surprising. The old man was, if nothing else, patient. And I would like to have a word with you in private. Naruto raised an eyebrow, glancing around the empty apartment. Aren't we alone? Far from it. You've much to learn if you truly believe you've ever been left completely to your own devices. The Hokage has always kept you under watch, as have I. It was true. He rarely bothered to say or do anything about it given that he'd suspected something like that several years earlier. But he was usually able to locate the people following him if he ever actually tried. But why try when he already knew that they were just keeping an eye on him? There was no ill intent. At least on the Hokage's part. If anything, they were probably there for his protection. Oh please. Why should I believe you? You shouldn't. The nature of shinobi is deceit. But this is of no surprise to you, I'm certain. I've come to realize that you aren't quite as hopelessly inept as you seem to enjoy acting. You've developed quite the facade, Naruto Namikaze. Namikaze? What? What was he talking about? Was he suddenly going senile or something? The idea that this guy would get his name wrong was baffling, to say the least. What do you mean Namikaze? You must have the wrong guy. I'm Naruto Uzumaki, old man. Quote. You would think so, wouldn't you? Names are quite the funny thing, at times. Some feel that name alone makes us what we are. I must disagree. Names hold little value outside of that which people give them, but people are foolish. They respect names and titles more than they respect those who hold them. But I digress. Suffice it to say that the presence of the Kyuubi within your body isn't the only secret that the Lord Third Hokage has kept from you over these years. I have some information that I'm certain you would like to access. That is, if you are willing to learn the truth, of course. But that choice is not one I can make for you. Heavens only knew what the aging shinobi had planned, but Naruto had never been especially fond of thinking over the risks before jumping into trouble. He was too valuable to be killed or locked away, and he had to admit that he was genuinely curious at this point. It couldn't hurt to go along with things for now, right? Fine. But who the heck are you? I tend to the roots that act as Konohagakure's foundation. You may call me Danzo. I must wonder, what are you doing here with this child? Naruto didn't have time to register what had happened before a simple but well-played genjutsu drew his mind into darkness. Danzu's head tilted toward the new arrival crouched on the windowsill in greeting. Unsurprised at his presence but less than pleased at the timing. So the dog has arrived at last. The young boy chuckled at the shinobi's barb. No need to be rude, Danzo-sama. I'm a child, after all. It's only natural for me to question my elders. No. I realized that you had some sort of interest in the Jinchuriki, of course, but I never thought you'd go out of your way to contact him. Well, not until you needed something destroyed anyway. Their kind has something of a talent in that department. So what are you here for? Nothing of importance to you, boy. Do you have the package that I was promised? The boy's mouth dropped in a playful imitation of shock and hurt. You doubted my skills. Why, I'm wounded to hear that you have so little faith in my boy. The single syllable elicited a sigh. Oh, very well. Yes, I retrieved your little toys and they're safely stored away in the place we've agreed upon. And it was no walk in the park, let me tell you. Those Uchiha really keep their tombs well guarded. It must be annoying to have something as valuable as the Sharingan, what with the thieves and all. Several times throughout the raid on Kagami's tomb he'd been forced to resist his urge to take a few of the Uchiha for his own. No one who truly calls himself shinobi can deny that acts requiring questionable moral decisions are sometimes necessary for the security of the village as a whole. Even Hiruzen and those buffoonish apprentices of his understood this fact. My request is merely one of many necessities. I trust that you didn't leave any loose ends. Of course not. Right now a loose end would bring quite a bit of fire down on us both. Besides, you know that I never leave a mess unless it needs to be left. He chuckled at his little joke, not caring that why he knew the true meaning behind the words. No need to clue the old man in any further. But really, I must admit I'm surprised. I wouldn't expect you to even mention something like that in front of the kid. My reasons are mine, and mine alone. Now, is that any way to maintain a healthy relationship? How can you expect me to trust you with my secrets if you can't trust me with yours? And, let's not forget who it is that's been putting himself at risk to maintain contact with our mutual friend. You can't contact him, so unless Madara intends to come personally explain his plans to you in detail, then you need me to make nice with that little spy of yours. Save for a grunt of admission, the elderly shinobi ignored him. I assume you've dealt with the shadows. Oh, you mean the Anbu that the Hokage has watching the place. They're taking a little nap at the moment. You know, you'll have to stop ignoring me and changing the subject sooner or later. His expression shifted, his entire demeanor suddenly lacking in the cheery, youthful signals it had previously held. What is it precisely that you want with the Jinchuriki? They stared at one another in silence until Danzo decided that it wouldn't hurt to give just a little. After all, a distrusting pawn was a less efficient pawn, and this one had potential. My intent was to confirm some recent suspicions regarding his power. And what he understands of that power. Now I suggest you run off to make sure your masters aren't checking in on their loyal little hound. And with that simple explanation the jovial youth returned. Hey, right. He stepped over to the unconscious blonde on the floor, looped an arm around his waist, and flickered away. A moment later he returned, having deposited the boy in his room, and put a hand on his hip as the other moved in sarcastic wave at the older shinobi. Just make sure you don't get the kid in too much trouble. He'll be useful to us in the future after all. And just how might he be of use to a child such as you? Unless you intend to hand him over to your associates. He clasped his hands together over his lap, a relaxed posture to hide his hand's proximity to the kunai beneath his robe. How would I find him useful? It's quite simple, Danzo-sama, because that boy has a knack for causing trouble. And the world, a lower, far more sinister chuckle erupted from his lips. The light-haired boy made a show of pushing his glasses back into place, serpentine eyes filled with far more knowledge than those of a child his age should have contained. The world is so much more interesting when things are in motion, wouldn't you agree? Kai. And the younger of the two disappeared, leaving the elderly shinobi alone in the apartment with the unconscious Jinchuriki once again. The child had probably been well on his way back to his home by the time the genjutsu had become noticeable. Clever boy, Yakushi-san. But this wasn't the time for that. No, he needed to have a word with Naruto Uzumaki. And it clearly wasn't going to be happening until he awoke. Yet he couldn't remain in the boy's apartment. It wasn't as though the third Hokage had him followed, even no. Hiruzen trusted him far more than he should have, all the more evidence that his ability to do what a leader must was fading, but it would undoubtedly draw attention if he disappeared around the home of the Jinchuriki for any significant period of time. And Naruto's own shadows would be likely to notice if Kabuto didn't catch them early enough, or his jutsu wore off too soon. Either way, they needed another meeting place. And he knew of one that just might work. If the vessel could actually reach it, then it would only go to show that he was far more than he let on. If not, well, he would have to ensure that Fu and Torun tailed the boy to prevent anything unsavory from happening. It wouldn't do to lose access to one of their greatest assets, or worse yet, release the beast upon the unsuspecting Konohagakure. Several hours later, as the sun began to rise, when Naruto finally dragged himself back from the depths of his rather pleasant dreams of a bowl of ramen, and for some strange reason, a miniature version of Manda and Gamabunta dueling over an annoyed Katsuya with a set of chopsticks, he noticed the small piece of paper sitting on a section of his breakfast table that had been cleared off. One that he was certain hadn't been present before he'd passed out. What did happen there? It seemed almost like a genjutsu. Not that he was an expert. For all of the strength he'd gained over the years, genjutsu was still easily his greatest weakness. He just couldn't seem to get a handle on the stuff, plain and simple, at least aside from breaking some weaker illusions. Either way, he hadn't seen Danzo do anything, so maybe someone else had interfered. He picked the paper up, turning it over in his hand a few times. Blank, save for a small marking identical to those used by Anbu. Not surprising though. The old man had always been a sneaky one, so the idea that he'd leave something in plain sight without any kind of special measures to make certain only the right people saw it was laughable. He began to flow his chakra through it and looked over the sheet again a few more times, a frown coming to his face when nothing appeared after several minutes. That clearly wasn't what the old man was expecting him to do. Maybe this was all just some bizarre trick. Or maybe it really had just been a dream. No, he was certain it had been real. The presence of this note alone was enough evidence of that. Something was off. It had to be. While Danzo hadn't shown any signs of surprise in the quick glimpse he'd managed to get of the older man before passing out, somehow Naruto just knew he hadn't intended for their meeting to end so abruptly. But nothing seemed out of place, and the paper was almost completely blank. Even when he tried flowing chakra through it, nothing happened. It was his only clue. But, wait a minute. Man, I'm such an idiot sometimes. He should have thought of it before. He already had a perfectly good method of examining chakra signatures, so this could at least confirm whether or not Danzo had left something or if he was just becoming paranoid. The Jinchuriki stood still, allowed the natural energy around him to flow and merge with his own chakra. And within seconds he could feel the change. And then he sensed it. The faint trace of chakra stored inside Danzo's clue. A chakra that he knew all too well. That explains why I couldn't cause a change with my normal chakra. He dropped out of sage mode, instead focusing on drawing out the Kyuubi's power and lacing it through the paper. He wasn't disappointed. The dark force triggered. The release of its counterpart sealed within the note, twisting and drawing the powerful chakra back into its rightful place within its current vessel. And as soon as it was gone, a symbol appeared briefly on the paper, fading as words began to reveal themselves. If you wish to understand the truth of which I spoke, meet me in the following location 1 hour past midnight tomorrow. North of the V. Yaj is a place known as the 44th Training Ground, though you have likely heard of it only by its popular nickname, the Forest of Death. 10 kilometers toward the center of this forest is a tower. I will be awaiting your arrival within. Do not arrive late. Do not allow yourself to be followed. Naruto yelped as the paper sparked, going up in flames just as he finished reading. Would he show? Damned right he would. Naruto didn't know what this truth that Danzo kept preaching about was, but it was bound to be interesting if the man was already making a move. Not to mention that he wanted to know just how the older shinobi managed to get his hands on some of the Kyuubi's chakra. He was no seal master, but Jiraiya had given him plenty of lectures on the subject, and he'd never heard of someone drawing chakra straight from a Jinchuriki that wasn't using the stuff, since it was typically safely locked behind some form of seal away from all but the Jinchuriki itself. Well, aside from the Akatsuki. But between the ones calling themselves Pain and Madara, the organization was an exception to the rule. Besides, he would be bored out of his mind if he didn't try to help fix Someth. And he'd done wrong before, and there was no way he'd let Gaara have all the fun. But for now, he needed something to do. About 4 hours later, Enko Mitarashi came to a sudden halt on the way to the gate leading out of the village. She stood in the street, head tilted to the side and eyes narrowed. Yo, Fission, the call was silenced as Anko twisted around and grabbed the flying ball of orange chaos midair. Then flung him into the ground at her feet with little more than a quirked eyebrow. Said ball of chaos rubbed at the back of his head while sending a glare at the young woman. Ow. Don't gimme that. The hell they teachin' you little maggots at the academy these days? What kinda ninja screams out his target's name when he's trying to jump him? Naruto ignored the question and squinted his eyes at her appearance. What? She glanced down at herself. There was nothing showing and nothing all that different from her usual style. What ya lookin' at? He ignored her again, taking a meant to prod at the metal mesh on her abdomen with his fingers a few times. The heck is this stuff? Oh, he knew what it was. It wasn't as though Mitarashi was the only ninja in the village with the sense to wear some form of armor. But her responses were always entertaining. He hadn't known her very well in the past, but in the several instances he'd paid attention to her this time around she never really seemed to have that hidden anger towards him that many of the others did. He'd have to ask about that someday. Sorry brat, but since I'm about to go on a mission it's off with the net, on with the mesh. Afraid you're gonna have to get your jollies somewhere else today. Jollies? What's a jolly? Is it like some kinda candy or something? If he were older he could have just flirted, teased her back, or something of the sort. As it was he was basically limited to trying to embarrass people. Her eyes widened in embarrassment. It wouldn't have been so bad if this was one of her colleagues. But sometimes she tended to stick her foot in her mouth when she dealt with this kid. Oops. I guess you might still be too young for that kinda thing. Just forget I mentioned it. But I want some jollies. And to be completely truthful, he had no idea which one of them was more fun. Come on, just gimme some jollies lady. Though the sudden anxiety in the woman's expression as her eyes darted between the people walking about the street, several of which were sending them odd stares, was pushing it in favor of embarrassment. Ooh boy, she dug into her pocket and pulled out some change. Listen, how about you just forget this conversation happened and have some ramen on me? Sound good? Ramen. The money disappeared from her hand before she could blink. Heck yeah, catch you later fishnet. And ramen was had. Unfortunately, even the power of ramen noodles from the most excellent ramen master in the world could only keep him busy for so long. The rest of the day passed agonizingly slow. As if the world had slowed down solely to keep him from discovering whatever secrets Danzo planned to explain that night. Finally, after what felt like years of waiting, nightfall had come. Sneaking out from under the eye of his watchdogs wasn't difficult. A few simple shadow clone tricks and they thought he was walking either to his home or the market. Either way, they clearly hadn't caught the memo that someone who had a demonic fox locked in his stomach could probably come up with a double diversion. Sneaking into the forest, likewise, posed little difficulty. They didn't really guard the place because no one was stupid enough to enter in the first place, much less alone, and even if they did odds were that most would cause enough of a ruckus to alert night guards in the village to anything coming their way. Naruto Uzumaki was not most people. Between short bursts of sage mode and the Kyuubi's chakra, avoiding any of the forest's wildlife without drawing any attention to himself was one of the simplest missions he'd had that didn't involve pulling weeds. He was at the tower within the hour. Danzo greeted him with a silent nod, waiting just as he'd said. You've come. Yep. Then you believe me when I say I have something of significance to tell you, something about your past. Naruto gave his own nod in response. Very well. But I must warn you. There is a condition that comes with this information. What kind of condition? This condition. He held a small slip of paper, just a couple of inches long and slightly less wide, and held it out for the younger boy. Naruto glanced over it and turned suspicious eyes on the shinobi. A seal. You want to put a seal on me? Yes. Danzu's calm exterior didn't slip, likely having expected this from the start. What for? The details I'm prepared to offer are not public knowledge for a reason. The third Hokage, the elders, and I agreed that it could be a potential threat to you and to this village if it were to be released. The only reason I'm presenting you with this opportunity is because you have proven far more capable than we expected, a foolish error on our part. His single eye opened only a small fraction, though the expectation in that tiny window of visibility was obvious. So this seal, it'll keep me from talking about whatever it is you're telling me. Precisely. Naruto held the paper up to the light for a closer examination. Does it do anything else? Anything I might need to know about? You don't trust me at my word. Naruto paused, shook his head. He didn't plan to lie to the man. He didn't seem offended by the gesture. If anything, the admission seemed to please him. Very good. I'd have been disappointed if you were naive enough to make such a mistake. Even more so after the skill you've displayed thus far. There is another effect that this seal is designed for. Not only will it induce paralysis should you attempt to discuss what I would tell you tonight, but it will allow me to track your location at all times. I'm not sure I like that idea. And you shouldn't. Very few people would appreciate such a restriction. However, I'm rather certain that you will find it agreeable once you've heard what I have to say. If you truly wish it, I could remove that particular restriction after we have discussed the matter which has brought both of us here. The silence, however, is non-negotiable. Naruto remained silent for several minutes, tossing the idea around in his head. Thankfully, Danzo seemed content with giving him the time to do so. On one hand, there was a good chance that the man was lying, or at least not telling him the entire truth. He'd even openly acknowledged that he didn't believe it would be wise to trust him. If Seal did more than track and silence him, if he'd bluffed about removing it, but on the other hand, he'd spoken of a secret regarding the past, his past. How many times had he wanted to know something, anything, about his family? His background. Maybe it wasn't some kind of fluffy story, orphans rarely had those, but at least it would be something. And if he was telling the truth, no, he couldn't let a chance like this just slip by. Do it. Danzo nodded and took the seal. Hold out your tongue. Naruto complied, fighting against his nerves as the one-eyed shinobi placed the seal near the back of his tongue. There was a quick flash of unfamiliar chakra as it activated, a feeling of numbness, and then he was back to normal. Danzo pulled the paper away as it sparked much as his note had, all traces gone in a flash. Now, we have much to discuss, young Namikaze. Stop calling me that. Naruto jabbed his thumb into his chest. I'm Naruto Uzumaki, the #1 unpredictable ninja of Konoha and you are the son of the late 4th Hokage, Minato Namikaze. I don't. Did you truly not notice the similarities? Even carved in stone, the likeness is remarkable. Surely you've looked in a mirror before. Seen the resemblance between your faces. Why yeah, I guess we look kinda alike, but that doesn't mean, it couldn't be, could it? It would be impossible, insane, but at the same time, how could no one know? How could no one say anything? As I've said, a great many things have been kept from you, but not without reason. Then tell me, he cried out, arms flung to the side and voice strained. Tell me why I couldn't even know my own father's name. Do you know what it is to be Hokage? Huh, a Hokage's life is battle. A Hokage's life is sacrifice. Not only was your Ather a man of the highest rank achievable by any shinobi, the face that every nation will see when they think of their rivals in war, but he was a legend on the battlefield long before he attained that title. Do you believe such admiration and fame came without a price? Well no, but, I just don't understand. Why couldn't you tell me who he was? No matter your control, you are still just a child. And there are many who could and would have taken advantage of this fact. Minato Namikaze had many enemies. There are many who would gladly take their vengeance out on his son if the opportunity were to arise, or worse yet, who would capitalize on the legend to turn a child such as you into a weapon against this village. We could not allow that. Naruto sat on that for a moment, considered the older man's words. That, actually sounded pretty reasonable. Danzo was probably just trying to manipulate him, he expected that much, but he couldn't spot any flaws in his reasoning so far. But what about my mother? Why haven't I ever met her? He swallowed the lump in his throat. This was the question. His father, well, he supposed that if his father really was the previous Hokage then it was understandable. They did it to protect him. But his mother, what was her excuse? There had always been a hope deep inside of him that she was alive, yet at the same time it brought up the horrifying possibility that she simply didn't want him. Your mother died in childbirth. And that was it. Dead. Gone. He could feel the pain in his gut, the tremble of his shoulders, the wetness in his eyes. He tried to wipe away along with the knowledge that he would never meet her. But he knew. Finally, after so many years, there was an answer. But Danzo was speaking. Her name was Kushina Uzumaki. Kushina Uzumaki, it was a beautiful name. And it was her name, his name. Danzo watched patiently for several minutes of silence passed as Naruto sorted through everything he'd learned so far. His mother, Kushina Uzumaki. His father, Minato Namikaze. His father, the fourth Hokage. But wait, that means. The fourth Hokage, my father, sealed the fox in me. He could feel the anger building, an incredible fury that his own flesh and blood. The man he'd admired most and dream of meeting more than any other, had made his childhood a living hell. What might have been the most important man in his life, the one who had taught his sensei. Been the apprentice to his other sensei, the successor and friend of a man he thought of as a grandfather, was responsible for that thing sealed inside of him. Yes. Danzo nodded, unaffected by the blonde's growing rage. Why? Allow me to tell you a story of sorts. He ignored the flash of confusion on the blonde's face. Your mother was arrogant, she refused to do as she was told. She started fights repeatedly, and when she didn't start a fight she jumped into the fray at every opportunity. She was brash, rude, loud, obnoxious. Naruto's fists tightened. Anger rising with every insult Danzo threw at his dead mother. He clenched his jaw, prepared to speak out in her defense. However, she cared very deeply for this village and its inhabitants. No matter how greatly she may have disliked certain individuals such as myself. Her skill in the art of ninjutsu was pitiful in most regards, but her style was unique and effective. She had no lack of skill in taijutsu and genjutsu. And her mastery of sealing techniques was nearly unsurpassed, no doubt a result of her heritage and upbringing as a member of the Uzumaki. But most importantly, the eye opened. Focused on the child before him, engrossed in every word, aware on some level that the man was telling the truth, that he had an answer. Kushina Uzumaki was the last Jinchuriki to hold the Kyuubi no Yoko. Naruto had once read Jiraiya's books. They'd always seemed so cheesy, so lame. One of them had included a big revelation, a surprise for the hero described as world-shattering and life-changing. He'd snorted and tossed it aside. Revelations weren't like that in real life. He was wrong. What did you just say? He couldn't believe it, wouldn't. The Kyuubi attacked the village the day he was born. His mother died in childbirth the day he was born. His mother was the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi. That meant his birth was. I cannot claim to know the exact details of that night. No one can, save for those who were present when it occurred, and to this day only one may live. Naruto's head shot up, intent eyes returned to the aging warrior. The seals which trapped the demon fox within your mother became weaker during the birthing process. Her status as a Jinchuriki was not well known, but some of the select few who knew of her condition were also aware of the threats posed to the seal. Your father and the third Hokage's wife were among them, and both were masters of sealing techniques. However, something went wrong. One man, a powerful warrior calling himself Madara Uchiha. It took all of his willpower not to reel back at the name. Madara. The man who had attacked his village. The man who worked alongside Pain and the Akatsuki. The man who, though Danzo had not flat out confirmed it, had been responsible for the deaths of his mother, father, and many of those loved by his closest friends. There were few people in the world who Naruto could claim to hate. But there was now one name which had solidified its position at the top of that list. Madara Uchiha. He would die. Maybe not today, maybe not this year, but he would die, and it would be at Naruto's hands. This man, the Uchiha who betrayed this village and attacked the first Hokage, forcibly removed the Kyuubi from your mother and led it on a rampage against our people. As you know, the third and fourth Hokages led the battle to push it back. I only learned of the details afterwards, from Hiruzen himself, but you will have to settle for second-hand knowledge. Naruto nodded, unable to form the words. Your father could not allow Madara and the Kyuubi to continue. Even with the might of the entire village and his summoned allies, the Kyuubi was pushing our forces back. So your father teleported himself and the Kyuubi to your mother, who was barely clinging to life, and doing what she could to protect yours. She possessed a unique chakra that made her ideal as the Kyuubi's host. 1W. Hitch allowed her to create chains of chakra capable of restraining it, even if only for a short time. Your father knew that their time was limited, and so he chose someone with whom he believed he could trust the power of the Kyuubi. The tears began to appear again, to pass through the shock as Naruto understood, truly understood what he was being told. You, his only son, the last legacy of the Namikaze and Uzumaki. The fourth used an immensely powerful seal to permanently bind half of the Kyuubi's chakra where it could not be reached at the cost of his own life, and sealed all that remained within you. So tell me, he stood, hunched on his sword as though it were a cane, his features, not quite gentle, but perhaps in camaraderie as one man who had lost a loved one through sacrifice to another. Do you still hate him? No, no. Quote, then I have nothing more to say on this matter. I think we have discussed enough for tonight. I'm afraid I know little of their personal lives, so I cannot tell you any stories or facts beyond their careers. I understand. He needed some time alone anyway. Time to process, time to mourn properly. Naruto turned to leave, stopped only just as he reached the door. There is one thing that I shall leave you with before you go. He turned, hand shooting up to grab the object coming towards him. He flipped it upright, looked it over, and turned to Danzo in confusion. It must have shown on his face. A tool of your father's. A special form of kunai used by him, and him alone. I felt it was appropriate. Thank you. Danzo acknowledged it with a nod, finally allowing Naruto to return to his home. 2 weeks earlier. He pressed upward on the hilt, letting loose another chuckle when the young boy's eyes narrowed slightly in frustration, though without any true signs of pain. And what might that be? Your betrayal wasn't the first. And the snake-like eyes widened as a familiar voice spoke quietly from behind him. Long time no see, Orochimaru. That voice, I know that voice. He turned around to glance at the newcomer, double-taking as he caught sight of just who it was, certain his eyes must have been deceiving him. Wait, you're... The cry was cut off as a hand shrouded in flame stabbed through his abdomen, sending a stream of crimson splashing across the boy against the pillar before the serpentine member of the legendary three could react. But how? Aren't you saw? The fist twisted inside of the infamous shinobi's chest, forcing him to stop as though liquidy coughs drove another spray of blood from his lips. Even it had only been a few moments since the struggle had begun. He seemed far weaker, paler than before. I'm sorry to cut the fun short so early, but I'm afraid I've run out of patience. Good night, Orochimaru of the Sannin. An inhuman screech filled the air as the legendary shinobi's body was enshrouded with flames. The boy really, sauntered over to the annoyed Uchiha and ripped out the kusanagi with a wet crunch. Bones cracked and muscle tore away from his fellow conspirers' palms at the action, a smirk mirroring that of the Sannin's passing across his lips for a moment. Well, that was rather fun. Have you not had enough games? Itachi's face had gone white, eyes finally showing the signs of exhaustion concealed when Orochimaru was present. He dropped to a knee with a grunt, hands resting lifelessly as red streams flowed to the earth. Oh, you're no fun. Though I suppose I wouldn't be very pleasant if my hands were falling apart either. The younger boy ignored the jab, forcing himself to stand again. I take it you've already made contact with Danzo-sama. But of course, Ida-chan. He was pleased to hear from us. Don't call me that. And I'm sure he has plenty of tasks ahead for his little pawns in the future. With the way you've been acting, everything you've told me, I assume you've concocted some kind of plan to deal with our mutual enemy. He flexed a hand, wincing at every movement and eliciting a sigh from the other boy. Would you just sit still for a moment? Here, give me those. The light-haired shinobi raised a hand, a slight glow enveloped in the Uchiha's palms as healing chakra ran through his flesh, bones repairing themselves, muscle and skin stitching back together. As for my plan, I don't have much in the way of a plan, to be honest. He released a low, rumbling chuckle. With a tilt of his head, 3 figures dropped from the trees above them, standing slightly behind their master. Itachi's eyes widened in a rare, open display of emotion. Though whether in shock or terror he wasn't certain. He knew these people. The first 2 were clad in the famous armor they'd worn in their warring days, nearly unstoppable and revered by friend and foe alike. The third, a young woman, was dressed in an elaborate kimono. Her fiery red hair was twisted into 2 buns and decorated with seal tags, topped by a shimmering tiara. Any shinobi that had lived through the Great Wars, or even paid the slightest attention to the history of those wars, would have recognized these people, and likewise would have recognized that they should have been dead for decades. But I figured I'd start here. A twisted smirk etched itself across Kabuto Yakushi's features as he gestured to the Senju and Uzumaki trio, present at the courtesy of the Infamo. A forbidden technique created by the second Hokage, with his free hand. And see where things go from there. The end. Thanks for watching, also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.